the Quincy King, the Son of God, the almighty Yhwach, or as I'll be calling him throughout the rest of this video, Yhwach. This video has been in the back of my mind for quite some time. With Core 4 currently airing, it was the push I needed to get this video out there. I absolutely adore this character. Yhwach was the very first reason I ever got into Bleach, and upon reading the story, he more than delivered for me. This video not only serves as appreciation for Kubo's creation, but a deep dive into the character himself, to really get across how masterfully constructed this character is. I'll be talking about Yhwach every which way I can. To start things out, I'll be going through a majority of the Sternritter, exploring how they each help characterize him, showcasing just like how for every battle Ichigo is in helps explore and grow his character. Every single fight within the 1000-year Blood War that has a Sternritter involved characterizes Yhwach. The Quincy race as we know it exists because of this man's blood, a race of people that end up reifying concepts and weaponize them against the Soul Reapers. Fear, heart, balance, divinity, and eventually fate itself. A people severed from their roots by the balances of the universe to a point where they have to become the ultimate thieves just to survive. Symbols, powers, or spaces, they'll take anything and everything. I'll be leaving individual segments in the video timebar, so you can not only skip to specific Sternritter if you wish, but also any other individual character segments. Following the Sternritters up, I'll be exploring some of the religious symbolism and inspiration he has, predominantly within Buddhism, Christianity, and Judaism. Then, more specific character dynamics he has that showcase different sides of him, like the meta-narrative authorial bout he has with Squad Zero's ringleader, Ichibe, the reflections he shares with the Soul Society's High Traitor, exploring how those reflections eventually point towards the two opposing one another, taking a helping hand and exploring them through the lens of the late philosopher Nietzsche. And then, of course, the other two main individuals who help bring the final antagonist down, with Ichigo Kurosaki and Uryu Ishida and their displays of sheer courage. And now, what better way to start out this video than with a fan favourite Sternritter, who serves as insight into the very crux of Yhwach's character. The only other Sternritter other than Uryu who we see Yhwach personally interact with upon bestowing his shrift. There's already a bond between them deeper than the others, but looking at Asnod's condition, it becomes even clearer. He has no agency, his limbs are motionless, he cannot speak, move, barely even breathe. Chapter 565, God Like You, showcases Yhwach's origins, a child with no agency. The only reason that Yhwach was able to get out of that state was because of others. It's an exact one-to-one with Asnod and Yhwach himself. But something else to tie them in together, the only thing Asnod has is sight. Given just how important sight is to Yhwach's character, he functions like a primitive version of the king. The only thing he had was observation. Once he became strong enough, that observation was weaponized and enacted on the universe. Asnod's condition, reflecting Yhwach's deepest fear, is not only done mechanically, but embodies the philosophy of that fear. Yhwach's entire doctrine is an attempt to erase the uncertainty that accompanies mortality. By creating a world where death, separation, and the unknown cease to exist, he believes fear itself can be abolished. Asnod represents this emotional foundation upon which his entire ideology rests. Asnod represents the first two steps, the foundation stones that Yhwach uses to walk across the next three. Alongside reflecting the crux of Yhwach's character, he represents the overall position Yhwach takes within the narrative. As the final antagonist, Yhwach is antithetical to Bleach's core thematics. To highlight this, I'd like to bring up Bleach's first poem, We Fear That Which We Cannot See. The very first words Kubo gives us to introduce us to his story. Throughout Bleach, ignorance creates fear. The greatest example of this would probably be Ichigo not understanding the hollow within and how it scares him. constantly rejecting it and never integrating it. By gaining perspective and understanding that fear diminishes, Asnot completely reverses this poem. Upon using his Volstandig, his fear ability is instilled through the optic nerves. He's completely working against the framework that the story has built for itself since chapter 1, turning we fear that which we cannot see into we fear because we can see. Knowledge is fear, vision itself is corruption. The Thousand-Year Blood War is cemented in people self-actualizing. As the final antagonist, Yhwach completely removes any semblance of individuality, both within himself and the Quincy race as a whole. Throughout the story, Bleach has cemented that combat and communication are intrinsic to one another. Yhwach separates the two. Not to mention how integral combat and struggle is to growth. Yhwach being abhorrent of conflict is him rejecting the framework through which Bleach is built. The aspects of Yhwach and Asnot's sides are opposites of the same principle. Yhwach's Almighty sees every future, completely removing uncertainty and fear for himself. Asnot forces others to perceive horrifying truths, not to mention how visually similar his Volstandig form is to the Almighty. His Volstandig form translates to fear of God. The fear of being rebuked by His Majesty consumes Asnot. Without Yhwach, he is nothing, arguably the greatest representation of the Stone Ritter relying on Yhwach to even exist. Yhwach gave him that which he desired most, autonomy, movement, agency, and purpose, but at the cost of complete dependence. Everything he does is subsequently out of a fear of disappointing His Majesty. This transactional life reflects the entire Vandenreich. Every Quincy receives life from Yhwach, every Quincy ultimately belongs to Yhwach. Their purpose, their powers, their life all revolve around another person rather than themselves. Asnot's fight against Rukia is also a reflection of the final fight thematically. Rukia doesn't conquer fear by removing it entirely, rather by accepting it and then overcoming it. It's why when she previously tried to completely negate it by becoming one with death, it was overwritten. Only when Byakuya gave her words of strength and she reflected on herself did she best him. Yhwach believes fear is proof there is something wrong with the universe. The main cast refutes this, with life being meaningful because of fear. Asnot's fear, originally being a terrifying encounter, is made quite sad and almost pathetic once Byakuya points out his own fears. His fear is more a projection of himself than what's within others. Something constantly used during his fear ability are flies. Flies within the Bible were a form of punishment, most notably as the fourth plague of Egypt, but they're also naturally carriers of disease. Asnot's condition has him bedridden from seemingly some sort of illness, and he projects that sickness onto others. Thousands upon thousands of them crawling up your body as you're completely immobile. But this projection is also present within Yhwach. When he has Ichigo beaten and prepares to go down to the Seirete, he gives a monologue to those left around, stating that each time you feel joy, you will remember the fear of death that has been promised to you. Bleach antagonists and projecting themselves onto others is a given, but Asnot specifically showcases Yhwach's projection, the man so consumed by fear and despair more than anyone in the story. Any despair he enacts is a shallow projection of what he feels every waking moment. And as backwards as it is for being a terrifying monologue projecting himself, I can't help but feel sorry for him. Every time he feels any semblance of joy, it's immediately gone. Asnot is the perfect reflection of Yhwach, the outward veneer of terror, the foil of fear to the protagonist's courage, and beneath it all, a deep sympathy and pity. Royd and Lloyd, Quincy twins who share the same shrift. Twins often share problems with their individuality, being granted an ability by their king to distinguish themselves by turning into anyone helps mend that wound. However, this showcases Quincy existence as it's merely taking someone else's identity, constantly absorbing from their surroundings rather than expressing what's within. Take for example the reason that people even remember Royd. It's most likely not because of himself, more so the fact that he became Yhwach. I'm sure many people don't even remember his name, merely just attributing him to being fake Yhwach. Royd's ability is to copy the memories and mind of a person alongside their physical appearance. Not only does this directly correlate to Yhwach's power absorbing the memories of others, but he offers us a very personal and intimate look into the mind of Yhwach during his fight with Yamamoto. The anguish of having to step over the bodies the Quincy King once fought beside, this is purely Yhwach's emotions on screen. As Royd was never present during the first invasion, he most likely has no idea who these people are, living proof to the deep sentiment Yhwach carries. The only difference between Royd and Yhwach is how those emotions are communicated. Yhwach expresses very few emotions, but to say he feels nothing or that he's purely putting on a facade that he doesn't like conflict is harmful to his character. Royd helps highlight the inner conflict within Yhwach, how deeply he cares for the Quincy race, and yet his desire to save them requires their sacrifice. The clearest example to articulate the complex nature of Yhwach is that he's a character whose sense of self is arguably made up of everything but himself, yet he's simultaneously the most self-serving, self-centered character in the entire story. Yhwach's view of the Quincy is that they are life and sustenance for him. His viewpoint of them is inherently transactional, yet their emotions speak to him deeply, doubly showcased by his activation of the Ausfehlen. He thanks those below for their sacrifice, stating that they're comrades, helping one another come back to life and move forward. Looking at his expression upon activating the Ausfehlen, I sense no sadism or apathy from him, merely eyes covering a deep, deep sentiment. Yhwach's hand is forced because his goal takes precedence above all. Whilst the goal in Yhwach's vision is overall better for the Quincy race, sacrifice is inevitable. Conflict is inevitable, and he despises it. He's in an incredibly sympathetic position for me. His race and people have been persecuted and oppressed beyond belief. Those who enacted it live comfortably, whilst your people literally have to exist in their shadow. I can sit here and criticize his decisions, but I find it hard to see a future where this wasn't the outcome. But this fight also highlights another contradiction of Yhwach. He dislikes conflict yet berates Yamamoto for having gone soft, criticizing the qualities that are used to enjoy peace, yet his goal is rooted in everlasting peace. In his mind, the head must never be allowed to live comfortably. The head lives and serves for the people. Yamamoto sitting within peace is a betrayal in Yhwach's eyes. Allowing yourself to live comfortably is equal to forgetting all those who have suffered. To tie this into what I mentioned earlier, conflict and growth are necessary for one another, and Yhwach despising growth is him going against the framework of the story. As highlighted here, he condemns Yamamoto for changing, but change is exactly what healing looks like. Ichigo finally allowed himself to share the burden of protecting. Byakuya softened after his defeat by Ichigo, even Aizen in a very subtle manner. He interprets recovery as weakness because he himself has never recovered. Another thing that Royd does well is show us that anyone who understands Yhwach well enough begins to think like him. You understand why he wages the war, you can sympathize with him, but in doing so you adopt his absolutism. Royd demonstrates the persuasion of Yhwach's goal. Especially for me, I can absolutely see where he's coming from. But to tie Royd and Yhwach neatly together, Royd with his third eye represents inner vision and wisdom, especially within religions like Buddhism or Hinduism. The third eye helps perceive things beyond surface level appearances. Unlike the two physical eyes that observe the external world, the third eye perceives essence. Royd's shrift is basically this, where his brother Lloyd centers around another person's abilities and outward strength. Royd knows how a person thinks, feels, and acts. But just as Yhwach himself inverts many instances of religious symbolism, Royd's third eye is a representation of false enlightenment. The third eye meant to see through all illusions, Royd instead creates the perfect illusion. The third eye is also prevalent when attributing it to Yhwach himself, the number 3 being important for Yhwach's sight. Royd's inability to copy the power of the Almighty is instead reflected with his third eye, becoming almost aspirational. He wishes to perceive the identity with the same completeness that Yhwach perceives fate. If Yhwach resembles a false god who claims total knowledge and seeks to absorb all existence into himself, Royd functions almost like one of his emanations. The third eye in this context becomes a mark of borrowed omniscience, possessing extraordinary knowledge of another person, but none of it originates from himself. His insight is derivative, the mechanics of Yhwach's ability being to mend the wounds of anyone who touches him almost always acts as a double-edged sword. Royd highlights this. A third eye usually represents discovering one's true self, but Royd's power does the opposite. The better he becomes at understanding the yourself, the less room there is for himself. His gift is essentially self-erasure. Driscoll, quite a forgettable character to put it bluntly. On the surface, Driscoll merely shares a parallel to Yhwach's power. The more he kills, the stronger he gets, a direct correlation to Yhwach's only method of growth. Something a bit more intriguing, however, lies in Driscoll's actions. During the build-up to the first invasion, alongside the multiple Squad 1 members, the more pivotal character who's first to fall in the entire arc is Sasakibe. The manga itself holds weight to the action, but the new anime editions help paint even more layers to it. He's immediately snuffed out, not only to send a message to the Soul Reapers as a whole, but multiple to the head captain himself. Yet, like with every action Yhwach takes, as imposing and threatening of an action as it is, there's another side to it. An invasion succeeds through surprise, confusion, and overwhelming force. Killing Sasakibe beforehand accomplishes the opposite. It alerts the Gote 13 that the Quincy have returned. It gives Yamamoto time to mobilize. From a purely military perspective, it's an unnecessary risk. So then why? Why feel the need to send a message? Fear will often produce itself as domination, the insecurity born from a lack of control someone has. Yhwach ultimately reaching the pinnacle of control in becoming the embodiment of fate is a projection of this concept. Sasakibe is targeted not only because Yhwach fears a repetition of the same event in being stabbed in the back, but because of a general layer of insecurity to him. Insecurity is born from fear, it's only natural, no matter how well the veneer of divinity hides it. Not only does killing Sasakibe soothe the worry that those events will repeat themselves, but it's a boast towards the Gote 13. Yhwach desires to prove something, even when given an advantage and a warning, I'm still better than you. He wants to humiliate those who have humiliated him. He wants them to experience the very despair and helplessness that has been etched into his soul. Another projection of despair. Yhwach doesn't simply want victory because victory removes opposition. He wants complete psychological domination because domination removes uncertainty. His pride and ego had been wounded, and instead of acting purely out of a divine ideology, it is wounded humanity that retaliates. Depicted as something otherworldly that takes the narrative by force, yet the action of killing Sasakibe is profoundly human. All this to say, the shrift, the overkill, encompasses the invasion as a whole. It's overkill. At first glance, it's a showcase of overwhelming military might, but once picked apart, it reveals the humanity within the man enacting it, because it's not purely about victory, it's vindication. To get a better glimpse at the outward veneer of Yhwach's apparent apathy, it's worth looking at Sternritter who embody fragments of that disposition. Each of the Bambis show a sense of apathy towards life. Bambietta kills men she deems good-looking without second thought. Giselle transforms both allies and enemies into disposable puppets, valuing only insofar as they continue serving her. Her blood is needed in order for her power to work, amassing an army for herself through the unification of one person's blood. Much like the king, Lil Toto, quite an expressionless character, even when feasting on the corpses of friends and foes alike, death isn't treated as something emotionally moving, just mere utility. Their powers, personalities, and behavior all reduce people from individuals into resources. Roberts reveals that this isn't merely the eccentricity of individual Sternritter, but the philosophy underpinning the Vandenreich itself. Predicting the upcoming Ausfällen, Robert remarks that the Sternritter are ultimately ultimately nothing more than food for His Majesty. Food possesses no agency, no dignity, no identity beyond being consumed. Quincy cease to be people and instead become nourishment for the king's continued existence. Robert strips away every romantic notion of loyalty or brotherhood within the Empire and exposes the horrifying truth beneath it. Every Quincy exists only insofar as they are useful to Yhwach. This consumption holds ties to Lil Toto herself as the glutton, but this mentality becomes especially apparent after Bambietta's defeat. Reduced to an immobile corpse-like existence under Giselle's control, almost none of the Bambis express genuine horror or grief. Giselle delights in her new toy while the other three quickly move on. Their indifference reflects a world where life has already been stripped of intrinsic value. Under Yhwach's rule, friendship is secondary to utility. Giselle's treatment and usage of Bambi perfectly encapsulates Quincy freedom, because there essentially is none. Looking at the Bambis from the perspective of their group, they're also symmetrical to the structure of the Empire. Although they appear to be the only genuine social group among the Sternritter, their collective identity ultimately revolves around Bambietta. They had the opportunity to create something new, and yet restricted their identity to one person. Even after Bambietta loses everything that once defined her, the structure persists, because the person isn't what matters, only the hierarchy. Now, I'm sure many of you noticed the very apparent German inspiration the Von den Reich takes. This moral empathy the Bambis display helps showcase why the Von den Reich can function as a fascist state. Fascism depends on reducing individuals into tools. Personal identity takes a backseat whilst the function to the overall system takes precedence. Autonomy and agency revolves around obedience. The Sternritter live and breathe with the threat of death hanging above their heads via the Ausfehlen, their power and life quite literally being subservient to the higher power. Power survives by continually consuming those beneath it. Every Quincy exists as another potential sacrifice, another source of reishi, another life that may one day be reclaimed through the Ausfehlen. The Empire perpetuates itself through consumption, as Robert said, merely food for the king. Even symbolically, this pattern of consumption persists. Quincies are a race defined by taking. They do not create reishi but dominate it and gather what already exists. That philosophy extends beyond combat into imagery itself. The Von den Reich constantly evokes the aesthetics of Nazi Germany, a regime infamous for appropriating and corrupting older symbols, most notably the swastika or Hakenkreuz, derived from the Buddhist manji, a symbol of fortune, harmony, and the Buddha's footprint, before becoming inseparable from genocide and fascism in the modern viewpoints. Like the regime they visually echo, the Quincies repeatedly transform symbols of life into symbols of domination. Bankai, the Serete, multiple instances of real-life symbolism that I'll go over throughout the video. They do not merely inherit meaning, they consume it, reshape it, and subordinate it to Yhwach's will. Whilst we're on the topic of fascism, another prerequisite for its survival is the removal of individual agency. Such regimes cannot tolerate people who constantly question or who use their own conscience to make actions. They cultivate beings who behave like robots, subjects that will not refute, complain, or refuse any order given. In this regard, I'd like to take a look at BG9 and Cang. These two are pretty boring, to put it bluntly, and not to be the "this thing is bad on purpose" guy, but there's a reason for it. As I mentioned, fascism requires robotic individuals. Their only purpose is what they've been told to do. Beyond that, they're nothing, serve no purpose, and have no value. They represent the kind of individual fascist systems attempt to produce. BG9, the knowledge. He absorbs information thoroughly and without fault. Everything is data, scannable, identifiable. It's incredibly similar to an authoritarian state. The Nazis themselves were phenomenal at keeping records of their workings. Cang, the iron. Iron is rigid and unbending. He not only hardens himself physically but emotionally. He apologizes to Toshiro for stealing his bankai, yet ultimately refuses to acknowledge it as a being, merely reducing it to a weapon. It highlights how the Quincy reduce living relationships to resources. He possesses a code of honor, but a code that's stuck within the Quincy framework. Arguably the most on-the-nose depiction of fascism within the Von den Reich lies with Quilge OP, a complete apathy towards any semblance of life that isn't Quincy. His ideology can only see value in that bloodline, so much so his ability isn't physically capable of holding Quincy's. Anything he absorbs during his Volstandig is grotesque and impure. He is completely blinded by the purity of Quincy blood. His jail sets a boundary between an outside and inside who is pure and impure, who deserves freedom and who does not. Upon using his Volstandig and absorbing Ion, Quilge speaks on his monstrous and mutated appearance, yet the only way in which he's able to stand a chance against Ichigo is through this method of domination and absorption. It creates a contrast with Ichigo's own inner monster. Quilge is stuck viewing it as monstrous even though Ion has given him immense power and bolstered him, it's still an impurity. Ichigo's journey with White begins as a monster, a parasite invading his body, but over time integrates him. Quilge doesn't integrate Ion in him. He doesn't question how I can make this a part of me, because purity is achieved through exclusion of the other. Wholeness is achieved through acceptance of the other. The Quincy regime and identity is exclusionary. Our main character, and by the end of the story, the Soul Society, is more accepting. Quilge believes he's protecting purity by erecting absolute boundaries, but those same boundaries prevent him from changing. He literally cannot conceive of Ion as anything other than contamination, despite the fact it has become part of his strength. Every single part of Ichigo that he integrates was at one point depicted as villainous, but they eventually stop becoming foreign enemies and transform into a unified identity. Quilge is hardly unique in this regard. His worldview simply expresses, in its purest form, the ideology underpinning the Vandenreich itself. Having once suffered exclusion at the hands of the Soul Society, Yhwach rebuilt his people around the very principle that once oppressed them. For the superstar, on the surface he works similarly to Driscoll. His power is essentially another one-to-one with Yhwach's. The cries and cheers of James help empower the superstar Mask to defeat his opponents. But going beyond that, the star represents the Quincy symbol of the five-pointed star, tying the star into Christianity like the Star of Bethlehem announcing Christ's birth, or Christ himself being described as the morning star, the star that leads people to God. Stars symbolize someone chosen by the heavens, but where the Star of Bethlehem was originally made to lead people beyond itself, James's star leads only towards Mask. It's become self-deferential, demanding worship of itself. Quite ironic, since the Quincy race is arguably the least favored on the universal scale, but the real irony for Mask and what he represents for Yhwach is that Mask isn't actually the Stone Ritter, it's James. The power of this idol lies in the people that praise it. This reveal of James being the Stone Ritter is both a reflection and inversion of Yhwach's power. The idol is sustained by the believer rather than the believer by the idol. It raises an uncomfortable question regarding Yhwach himself. How much of a god exists independently of those who proclaim him one? Once humanity perishes and there is no one left to worship a deity, does the deity exist? The idea that God only exists through recognition is an idea people have wrestled with for a while. Gods are not merely beings of immense power, they are objects of worship. Worship is what separates a king from a deity. Mask externalizes this process through James. Every cheer, every affirmation, and every declaration of Mask's greatness literally manifests his strength. His miracles emerge not from isolated omnipotence, but from unwavering faith. This leads into an interesting contrast between Yhwach and his father. Does anyone actually worship the Reo? There is no on-screen depiction of anybody praying to the god of this universe. He exists as an indispensable body, rather than an active object of devotion. His divinity is entirely ontological. He is God because of what he is, not because of what anyone believes him to be. Yhwach's divinity is the opposite. He's divine because people believe him to be divine. His followers organize their identities around him. Now obviously Yhwach is also innately divine, but you get the idea. Something else this highlights within the dynamic of father and son. The Reo has no worshippers, yet holds the very fabric of reality together. Yhwach has an entire race backing him, yet has no ability to sustain himself. Yhwach's divinity revolves around a dependency. Adneus is completely self-sufficient. There's also substance when it comes to the name of James's creation, mask. A mask is used to conceal, to hide. On its own, it has no identity. James creates a persona so immense it overshadows himself. It's how public eyes can view celebrities or leaders. They stop seeing the person and become enamored by the idea. It's something not only in-universe characters fall victim to, but I myself too. It's easy to fall for the idea of Yhwach and not Yhwach himself. Ultimately, the father and son embody opposing conceptions of divinity. The Soul King is worshipped by no one because he has no need to be. His existence alone sustains the cosmos. Yhwach, by contrast, is never content to simply exist. His entire empire becomes an apparatus designed to affirm his kingship, his fatherhood, and finally his godhood. James helps expose the fragile foundation beneath that image. A god who depends upon recognition is, in some sense, still dependent. Each and every one of the Stunritters I've talked about thus far fundamentally distorts a human quality: mask and admiration, Quilge and purity, the Bambis and companionship. But what about the quality that humanity arguably prides itself on the most? Gremmy, the Visionary. His fight with Kenpachi serves as the starter before the main course when it comes to one of Bleach's core thematics. Gremmy's ability as the Visionary allows anything Gremmy can imagine to become real. In conversation for the most busted ability in the entire series, subsequently making it the breeding ground for very obvious complaints. How the hell do you lose with such a broken ability? This guy must be an idiot. And yeah, no shade to Gremmy, but that's the point. He isn't very smart. This is a child who has been imprisoned his entire life due to this ability. With little to no experience of the outside world, he is cognitively limited. This immense amount of freedom that has been handed to him makes it so his freedom is his prison. Juxtapose that with Kenpachi. Kenpachi's growth in the Thousand-Year Blood War showcases the shackles he's been subconsciously placing on himself throughout the entire story, whilst doing so in order to feel, in order to relive that euphoria he once possessed. In other words, Kenpachi's limitations are his freedom. Limitations are freedom versus freedom is limitation. The perfect synopsis for Yhwach and the final fight. These seemingly unstoppable individuals who can do anything whenever they so wish are in the end incredibly limited and blind. The Quincy as a whole lack capability to create things. They reside purely in the regime of taking. Everything the Quincy possessed once belonged to someone else. Applying this to Gremmy, he's the only person who can genuinely create from nothing, completely denying the laws of physics and the universe as we know it. In this sense, he's ironically more divine than Yhwach. Even when Yhwach creates the basis for Varvelt, it's merely a transformation of the material below. Despite possessing arguably the most divine ability in the story, Gremmy isn't invited into the Schutzstaffel, rather Yhwach locks him away. As one of the most powerful Stunritter, you'd think he'd be with the other heavy hitters by nature, but he's not, and I'd like to discuss why. During his fight with Kenpachi, we see multiple Stunritter commenting on Gremmy. His status within the Vandenreich is itself alien. Being this separated from a race so entwined with one another really sets him apart. The Visionary is one of the few Shrifts that doesn't obviously reinforce dependence on Yhwach's system of inheritance and reclamation. If Gremmy can genuinely create reality, then his power is not merely a fragment returning to the source, it's generative. In a regime built on everything flowing back to one center, being capable of independent creation is a contradiction. The central figurehead being the progenitor of the entire empire, having someone who can legitimately overthrow this leadership, it's no surprise why he was locked up. Creation is the embodiment of possibility, an endless amount of things Gremmy could conjure up. Yhwach's world is fundamentally closed. His almighty narrows reality towards an inevitable end. Both reshape reality through opposite principles. Yhwach's almighty embodies a complete collapse of uncertainty and struggle. Gremmy's ability is the most unpredictable thing in the entire story. This tells us that Yhwach fears the independence Gremmy could have. Kenpachi's sheer enormity when it comes to power level makes the guy who can imagine anything into existence envious of him. He's physically incapable of imagining himself getting stronger, only taking the strength of another. His imagination doesn't turn inward toward growth. How can I improve and best him, but outward toward possession? If I'm not strong enough, I only have to steal his strength. Gremmy is a fascinating anomaly within the Quincy. His shrift hints at the classical power of a creator god, yet he lacks the stable identity to wield it fully. His imagination can remake the world, but it cannot establish a self capable of mastering that world. In the end, the greatest creator among the Quincy is undone not by a lack of power, but by a failure of selfhood. Another one-to-one with Yhwach, Gremmy being the one who appears to transcend their defining logic, still falls back into acquisition. And on that note, let's take a look at another Sternritter who follows a similar framework. Askin, the death-dealing. Delving into more of Yhwach's contradictions, Askin is the perfect Sternritter to highlight this. The Quincy who desperately attempts to affirm himself in a regime that's built to erase the self in servitude for the regime. Askin assumes the role of a narrator, or indirectly gives out exposition throughout the Thousand-Year Blood War. Commonly, narrators are beings that have intimate knowledge of the plots, but don't exert any influence on it. In other words, they don't have a stake in it. Askin's mentality and mannerisms reflect this idea. He has a very laid-back attitude to the entire war. Acting as comedic relief, he doesn't really take anything too seriously. He's literally framed more as an observer than a soldier, sitting back with food in hand and binoculars watching fights happen, assuming the position of us, the audience, as we get to lavishly sit back in our comfy seats and look at the bloodshed. He wants knowledge without responsibility, desiring to witness history rather than create it. Similarly, Yhwach eventually occupies a higher plane of existence nearer the end of the story as he dominates the authorial power within the narrative. Askin is a smaller reflection of this narrative placement. A bit like Gremmy, he's a pretty standout Quincy. A layer of separation he has from the rest of the Quincies is his reason for following the king, where most do it out of fear or zealotry. Askin walks with curiosity in mind, juxtaposed by the rest of the Schutzstaffel, who take their roles very seriously. Each and every one of the other royal guards follow with absolute devotion. Curiosity is inherently tied to uncertainty, creating a situation that will be repeated with the rest of the royal guards, as Yhwach desires to completely remove the aspect of uncertainty. Askin's ideology is incompatible with Yhwach. Despite his membership within the Royal Guards, he's constantly underestimated by others, yet he's also adamant on downplaying himself, to the point where it's almost like he's pulling himself down from the almighty viewpoint of the narrator, whilst uplifting those that are put in opposition against him. If we take this role as the narrator, his curiosity itself becomes curious for us. For a character who's so entwined with the plot, surely he should already be aware of what kind of world Yhwach would make. Askin isn't really a complete narrator, but I think it's a nice tie-in that both of these highly intelligent individuals, when it comes to the plot, are essentially finding reprieve in the same thing. Despite how above it all they seem to be, there's also a major anchor holding them back in the role of their agency. Kubo himself undermines Askin's agency, painting him up to be above warfare not only in terms of being a narrator, but also how he interacts with fights, not liking to get his hands dirty or simply running away, and then sticking him to a singular aspect of symbolism being modern warfare. Askin is made to be different in ways he doesn't have agency over. He'll downplay himself to things he has no control over. Every time Askin downplays his strength, it's a separation from obligation and responsibility. Like I've been mentioning throughout the video, each of the Sternritter's power and strength isn't their own. Askin's strength being given to him by Yhwach explains the contradiction in downplaying himself and establishing himself as different in the same breath. In a bid to reclaim agency, he downplays aspects of himself he has no control over and distinguishes himself from others in a way that is entirely under his control. He desperately attempts to find worth in himself outside of what's been assigned to him, put him side to side with someone like Lille, who has immense pride in the power bestowed upon him, and the contrast is stark. But if we take it one step further, each of the royal guards have ties to divinity in one way or another. The left arm of God, the heart of God, the one closest to God. Askin is just some guy. Coffee, food, drinks, jokes, all of these really set him apart and give us the audience the blind spot of underestimating him. Going into his powers, Askin's ability, the Death Dealing, is a pretty ironic ability. Since Askin's kill count is a whopping 0, he rejects the purpose for which his ability was given, creating a disconnect between him and his power, subsequently meaning a disconnect between him and Yhwach himself. Yet that very disconnect is what makes them connected. Askin doesn't like conflict, trying to end fights as quickly as possible, an aversion to getting his hands dirty or straight up running from fights, not to mention how his ability constantly puts him further and further away from death, closer to the desire that Yhwach envisions. The death dealing represents Askin's desire to do things his own way. That need for self-affirmation comes to a close with his fight against Quilge. In terms of mindset, Quilge is what Askin wants to be. Quilge is self-assured, aware of his flaws and strengths, exercising his freedom and accepting his shortcomings. But this admiration is also somewhat another harmful reflection, as Quilge states, planning for every outcome to avoid death is essentially a human version of the Almighty, attempting to be all-seeing in order to avoid that which we fear most. His admiration for Quilge and his king has a tie-in, but another reason for this envy is made evident through their powers, destruction and preservation. Ironically, despite all his efforts to distinguish himself from his comrades, Askin falls in line with the overarching Quincy ideology of stagnation through inaction. Throughout the 1,000-Year Blood War, Askin spends his life trying to become someone separate from Yhwach. He refuses blind devotion, avoids needless violence, downplays the gifts bestowed upon him, and searches for meaning beyond the role assigned to him. Yet, despite all of this, he never truly escapes the king's shadow. By refusing to act, he unconsciously reinforces the very stagnation Yhwach wishes to impose upon the world. Quilge exposes this contradiction. The difference between them isn't intelligence or curiosity, but agency. Both understand the world, both seek knowledge, yet where Quilge uses knowledge to create possibility, Askin uses it to excuse passivity. He mistakes observation for freedom. Another tie-in between him and Yhwach, only realizing at the very end that true individuality isn't found by distancing oneself from the role one has been given, but by choosing what to do with it. All of that to help showcase how Askin doesn't appear to make much sense, and how that helps characterize Yhwach. The disconnect between himself and his power is the connection between him and Yhwach, constantly downplaying himself, yet purposefully making himself easily underestimated. I dislike conflict, yet Yhwach starts a war. His goal is rooted in peace, yet criticizes those who enjoy it. He tells Ichigo not to give up hope, yet laughs in his face when he sinks into despair. Askin prepares us for a king whose actions often appear contradictory on the surface, but rather than providing possible explanations or insight into complexity, he serves to help us recognize that complexity before delving into Yhwach himself. The more Askin tries to distinguish himself from Yhwach, the more he reveals that contradiction itself is one of Yhwach's defining traits. The heart of the Soul King, Gerard Valkyrie. Before delving into Gerard's characteristics, I'd like to firstly talk about foundations of Gerard's ability, the miracle. When the three worlds were one, the Soul King didn't have souls go through a cycle like it does now. Instead, he merely erased them from existence, the same way that Quincy's do now. It's also why Yhwach inherits the Quincy power. With this in mind, Gerard provides an interesting layer into the dynamic between Yhwach and his father. For how much Yhwach criticizes his father, how ashamed he is at the humiliating position he's maintained in, his heart is with his son. From my perspective, it's an incredibly tragic layer of subtext. Perhaps his father desires the same outcome as his son. His heart is with him in this journey. The suffering they've endured was unjust, and he's sorry he wasn't there to assist him. Going into some Can't Fear Unworld spoilers, the Soul King's will is unknowable. Nobody knows why he allowed the original sin to be committed, so the sentiment factor is merely a theory. However, it's still a very interesting thing for the Heart of God to march alongside the Quincy's, the supposed antagonistic force. But to get into Gerard himself, Gerard's sword Hoffnung lends insight into another layer in the characteristics of Yhwach, his relationship with despair. Hoffnung means hope. Whenever hope is damaged, it reflects back onto the attacker as despair, not to mention Gerard's body growing in size due to the people's fears, a correlation for Yhwach's strength growing as he experiences the people's fears more and more. But going back to Hoffnung, It's likely that Kubo took inspiration from a real-life individual, Gerard Hoffnung. The real Gerard believed hope produced joy, creativity, resilience, etc. Kubo takes hope and makes it produce despair and violence. Weaponizing hope, it ceases to be comforting. Much like Yhwach in his fight against Ichigo, the relationship with hope and despair within Yhwach and how he projects that on Ichigo is made clearer through Hoffnung, telling Ichigo not to fall into despair, parenting him not to give up hope. Words that are usually comforting actions have been turned cruel. An inverse of the actions that we're used to have been made fuel for the fire of antagonistic force. Speaking of inversions, Gerard the quote-unquote Valkyrie is an inversion of traditional Norse Valkyries. He is firstly neither Norse nor a woman, and secondly, Valkyries choose fallen warriors and conscript their souls into Odin's army. Gerard doesn't have much choice. Valkyries exist due to the meaning within death. Gerard's existence strips that meaning the more he persists. Death is more akin to a transaction. Wounds empower him, essentially the opposite of Valhalla. Instead of a glorious death leading them to Valhalla, death continually feeds Gerard's life. An irony of Gerard, much like Mask, is that Gerard constantly boasts that he's the strongest, yet his power doesn't originate from himself. It's the people's fear, the people's hope that gives him strength. His identity is literally a collective whilst being incredibly self-centered. Another obvious connection with the king, however, where they separate is in Gerard embodying hope because the impossible can still occur. Yhwach, through the Almighty, has immersed himself in a world where nothing is impossible because everything is predetermined to him. Tying this back to Gerard being the heart of the Soul King, this miracle of a being is almost a temporary expression of the human uncertainty that Yhwach seeks to erase. Following up on the inversion and corruption of symbols, however, there's also an in-universe case through which Gerard does this. One of Bleach's most important aspects being the heart, given major focus during the Arrancar saga, most especially with Orihime and Ulquiorra. Ulquiorra's character with the heart is one of Bleach's best moments for many people, from the cold, rational viewpoint of nothingness to finally understanding the connections between humans. Gerard turns the heart into something far more hollow. He doesn't question the heart, he doesn't really grasp the value of hope and fear. The heart is merely reduced to strength and power. Taking this a step further with their respective deaths, Ulquiorra's is deeply sentimental. Gerard's is anticlimactic. Isolating himself above the three captains, his demise is a twisted feeling of the heart being able to essentially become one with another in some aspect. 6 hearts beating as one. Yhwach's unification is a warped version of this. The heart is a transactional thing for the king. People grow from their connections, the entwinement of their hearts. It's no coincidence that Gerard essentially only fights people in group formats: Squad 0, the Visors, the Gote 13 squad, and eventually the 3 main captains. Whilst the metaphysical heart that Bleach teaches us does somewhat appear between these captains, Gerard pushes them beyond their limits, but predominantly in the tangible concept of the heart, their power level and strength. Where other instances of the heart being formed is meaningful because it's the opposition, that doesn't really happen with Gerard. The quips and comedic moments between Toshiro and Byakuya don't really come about from Gerard's impact. Instead, Gerard's impact is mostly translated through their evolved forms or moves. The reason Ulquiorra's heart reaches so many people is because it's innately human. Exists beyond that which we can see, and yet everyone knows the feeling all too well. Gerard's conclusion is inherently shallow because it removes the feeling of the heart, reducing it to something tangible: strength, miracles, and overwhelming power. In other words, it's supposed to be anticlimactic and hollow. His demise isn't supposed to be some grand catharsis. Just as Gerard embodies the transactional aspect of the heart, his own life was treated as such. It's a perfectly poetic ending for him. Exclusively fighting against groups, forcing hearts to unite against him, yet he can only measure that unity in terms of the strength it produces. He witnesses cooperation without ever understanding connection. In the end, the heart of God never learns what a heart is. Pernida may be the most conceptually unique and interesting member of the Royal Guards. Introduced as an unknowable creature, a mass of nerves concealed within a cloak, its true identity as the Soul King's left arm completely reframes its role. Pernida is the embodiment of evolution itself. Every encounter changes it, every wound becomes information, every organism it touches becomes another step in its own development. His shrift, the compulsory, is interesting for this. Compulsory means something that must be done by law, rule, or authority. It's an exertion of force that you must abide by, a parallel to Yhwach himself, where Pernida compels the body, Yhwach compels the blood. Both represent violations of free will disguised as gifts bestowed by a higher power. Pernida follows a similar pattern with Gerard in how they both indirectly characterize Yhwach and the Soul King. The left arm, the very embodiment of progress and evolution, chooses to stand beside the son who wishes to erase any concept of evolution altogether. When it comes to how important sight is for Yhwach, both Yhwach and Lille are synonymous with 3, but Pernida constantly remains at 2. At first this stumped me, but looking at all 3 altogether, the picture becomes a bit clearer. 2 serves as a fitting number to quantify Pernida. His defining ability is forcing nerves onto others. Everything Pernida does is an input-receive sequence. Pernida's dualism is also concretely highlighted by the other arm, Mimihagi. The 2 are always brought up together. If 1 is stillness, 2 is evolution, then 3 becomes transcendence. At least that's my reading of it. Pernida has no room for transcendence. He already resides within divinity from being a part of the Soul King. His evolution is less vertical and more horizontal. Another layer to this is with Yhwach's Almighty. He already knows about everything to come, therefore has nothing to overcome. Evolution inherently requires an obstacle to push one to grow and evolve. As the Soul King's left arm, it already possesses an innate divine function, but only as a fragment. His power lies not in omniscient sight, but in ceaseless interaction, adaptation, and growth through contact with others. In that light, too, becomes the appropriate visual motif, the perfect foil for Mayuri and Nemu, as they both thoroughly explore connection and evolution. Where Mayuri and humans in general have a capability to cognitively decide what aspects of growth are needed, Pernida's sense of self and consciousness is itself evolutionary. At the start he is animalistic, but by the end he and Mayuri can essentially have fully fledged conversations. But where they differ is that Pernida's consciousness is more reactionary than reflective. Mayuri and Nemu, being the ones to bring down the arm, holds weight with regard to Yhwach himself. Mayuri's growth was from one who believed in perfection to one who abhorred perfection, originally believing that he didn't have much else to learn, standing at the pinnacle of knowledge, to eventually criticize Zael for his ideology and powers being tied with becoming perfect. Yhwach's ability is as perfect as can be if we're looking at it from a purely mechanical standpoint. But ideologically speaking, Yhwach also desires a world where this form of motionless perfection becomes existence. Envisioning a perfect reality, this world would be the death of existence for Mayuri. What Nemu does in this fight specifically gives a parallel to Yhwach himself. She surpasses her creator's expectations, showcasing growth through protection. Whilst I'm not going to explore it too much right now, Yhwach surpassing the ultimate authority in Ichibe comes from a complete rejection of his philosophy. Speaking of Ichibe's authority, however, Pernida's fight quietly echoes an important theme for Yhwach: names. Nemu has a deep attachment to the original name that Mayuri granted her upon first gaining consciousness. Despite how not so great of a parental figure he is, the name holds immense weight for her, affirming her existence beyond that of a thing into becoming a someone. Pernida likewise rejects the name of the left arm and insists upon being called Pernida. But unlike Nemu, whose name nurtures individuality, Pernida's very identity seems defined by function. As the left hand and the heart, Gerard and Pernida weren't gifted shrifts by Yhwach. They already possessed the power and Yhwach named them. If Yhwach truly named Pernida, as he names and categorizes the power of the Sternritter, then Pernida's identity was never allowed to grow independently. It was granted a label that permanently tethered it to the role it performs. Yhwach takes the name of his people's god, becoming the savior of the Quincy race and fulfilling that role. Pernida follows in suit, fulfilling the role that was bestowed upon him. Ultimately, Pernida is another contradiction within Yhwach's empire, evolution serving stagnation. Bleach repeatedly argues imperfection is the source of all progress. Pernida's endless capacity to change becomes its greatest virtue, and the quietest refutation of Yhwach's dream of a perfect, unchanging world. This subsequently makes Mayuri's question so fascinating. Why is the left arm serving Yhwach? The in-universe answer would be because Yhwach gained control during his meeting with Ichibe, but thematically speaking, I think it boils down to the fact that Pernida is quite a reductive version of evolution. Evolution has no sense of morality, it doesn't hold belief or preference. It strikes a similarity with Mayuri. It's pretty amoral, the same way Mayuri never troubles himself with morality when it comes to science. But I think the larger takeaway from this is how it characterizes Adneus. If Pernida doesn't have much sense of morality, merely existing, simply performing its role without distinguishing good and evil, the same way the heart of God showcases the heart through a warped transactional process, disregarding the emotional aspect, the left arm shows evolution through a similar reductive lens, and if both instances of God embody multifaceted aspects in the most rigid way, it's no surprise why the Son of God's mindset follows suit. The x-axis, Lille Barrow, the self-proclaimed closest to God. It's no surprise given this closeness, Lille's character revolves around a major aspect of the king, sight. Throughout Bleach, seeing is rarely just seeing. Eyes represent knowledge, judgment, and one's understanding of the world. Lille is a culmination of that symbolism, a man whose entire identity is built upon believing he sees as God sees. To provide a nice juxtaposition and highlight this, I like to bring up his most significant opponent, Shunsui, to the fold. His fight against the head captain pits two opponents against each other who have the opposing eye closed. To discern the meaning behind these eyes, let's quickly take a look at Bleach's own in-universe religious symbolism, specifically the left and right hand paths. The right hand of the Soul King Mimihagi represents stillness and stagnation. The left represents evolution and progress. Shunsui, having his left eye open, showcases his viewpoint fixates on progression, the betterment of the Soul Society, taking it upon himself to make decisions that the former head captain never would have, such as freeing Aizen in order for that betterment, rejecting the rigid rule of Yamamoto, and accepting morally uncomfortable decisions if they move the Soul Society forward. Flip that on its head and we'll get Lille. His gaze is set upon stagnancy. Unlike Shunsui, who constantly adapts to changing circumstances, Lille never evolves ideologically. Every decision has already been made. God's will has already been decided. Ironically, Lille's only moments of growth occur when his left eye opens, yet these transformations never represent personal development. They merely reveal more of the divinity he already believes himself to possess. He doesn't take any drastic decisions that his comrades might question. He is always in line, an upright, unmoving force against a more loose, laid-back captain. Lille takes inspiration from a major figure in the Bible, that being Archangel Gabriel. Gabriel serves as the announcer of divine will, God's messenger. Rarely functioning on his own initiative, only when given orders does he act. Much like Lille, who never deploys an ideology devoid of his majesty. Unlike Jugram, Uryu, or Askin, who have internal conflict and in some aspects growth, Lille is intentionally static. Evident by the mechanics of his power, he shoots a singular straight shot. Anything he targets merely vanishes from existence. He has no new mechanics that are developed over time. He's incapable of curving his attacks or bullets. Constantly firing in a straight angle, he's incapable of sin. In biblical language, righteousness is repeatedly associated with straight paths, while sin is associated with straying from them. The word sin comes from Old English sin, but the biblical concept most evidently in Greek and Hebrew instances. The idea of sin comes from missing the mark. Lille is supposedly incapable of sin because he cannot miss his mark. The idea of being straight and upright holds weight in religion. Crookedness relates to straying from the correct path, being warped and twisted by sin. Straightness symbolizes truth and justice, a very righteous thing. Lille is the purest example of this. His existence is one continuous line towards God. His role as God's messenger is the clearest when unleashing his trumpet, symbolically representative of Gabriel's horn or trumpet. From Christian tradition, Gabriel would blow his horn to announce Judgment Day, but mathematically speaking, there's also another layer to this. Gabriel's horn is a geometric figure, described to both have finite volume and infinite surface area. A mathematical paradox. Lille's ability resides in a similar nature, his ability blurring between the finite and infinite. His attacks travel in a line yet ignore all intervening space. Distance ceases to matter when it comes to Lille. His attacks don't move like ordinary bullets, it's more a declaration. Subsequently, when Lille opens his eye 3 times, his body ceases to function normally. He cannot be harmed as his body now pierces anything attempting to reach him. In mathematics, absolute concepts often behave similarly. Infinity cannot be approached through ordinary intuition. Lille fits a similar category. He isn't just hard to kill, he ascends beyond what ordinary combat rules can quantify. His identity is bound to the x-axis. Gabriel's horn derives its existence by revolving around the x-axis. Therefore, both end up producing something that appears simple, yet yields properties that go beyond ordinary or even human understanding, which is also, of course, why he can only die by his own hand. When he states there is nothing you Soul Reapers can do, he's kinda right. If it weren't for his own strength backfiring on him, the entire Gote 13 would have probably been cooked then and there. Lille calls himself the closest to God. His sight revolves around seeing through everything. He's the closest to God merely because his sight is the closest anyone's ever gotten to imitating God's defining attribute. To tie all this back into Yhwach, the main crux of Lille's defeat is in his hubris. These almighty beings are brought down by their blind spots, their ability to see everything. It's what makes pitting him against Shunsui so great. Shunsui constantly admits uncertainty. He doesn't like fighting and will question decisions. The half-blind man is ironically much wiser than the all-seeing demigod. Every divine figure is ultimately brought down by their lack of perspective. Whilst Yhwach's is a lot more thematically executed, Lille's is purely meant to get the point of hubris across. Perfect sight is not perfect understanding. The paradoxical nature of his ability and body also holds weight with Yhwach himself. The very mechanics of his power forming an amalgamation of contradictions, subsequently leading to his identity and sense of self being so interpretable and complicated. Speaking of Sternritter, who are the closest to God, however, there's probably only one other individual who can challenge Lille on that standing. The balance. The other half of the Quincy King, Jugram, holds massive importance for Yhwach. But in order to really showcase why, we have to add another Sternritter into the mix, Bambi the Heat. The major tie-in between the dynamic of Jugram and Bazz is miscommunication. A prominent aspect of Bleach is that combat is communication, not only throughout their entire journey together or their time at the Vandenreich did the two ever truly communicate. Yugram's tragedy began before Yhwach ever got involved, that being an inability to properly communicate what he's feeling. Bazz and Jugram were never truly on the same wavelength from the very beginning. Neither of us said it, but we decided to kill Yhwach. The entire narration sequence in the flashback comes from Bazz's perspective. Jugram has no input on the narrative. Bazz takes control of situations as he sees fit, and Jugram is left entirely subservient to another person's will. This isn't to paint Bazz as morally dubious for this. He has his own faults, much like Jugram. They're both merely children. But Bazz's mistake is interpreting silence for agreement. It's the foundation stone for what makes their fight so tragic, the only time they've ever truly talked. Yugram's upbringing with an abusive uncle and Bambi with a noble, happy family, each of them having their lives destroyed, for one meant salvation, the other ruin. Bazz never really grasped that Jugram didn't want to keep living with his uncle. A relationship built upon this misunderstanding was destined to crumble eventually, and the driving force behind their division came from Yhwach. A highlight of how Quincy life is inherently tied to others, their sense of selves being dependent on another occurs in this flashback. The reveal that Bambi's strength isn't his own completely drains any sense of accomplishment within Bazz, a catalyst for the rift between the two as his sense of self-worth has been completely shattered. Yhwach's manipulation of a young, impressionable Jugram is predatory, essentially grooming him, saving him from his uncle and then giving him that which he desires most. recognition, to be needed. No doubt he feels indebted to Yhwach for ridding him of his uncle, but that's only because Yhwach desired it to be that way. Quite a dark reading from this flashback comes from the fact Yhwach has the Almighty during this time period, allowing the abuse from Yugram's uncle to occur in order for him to become his savior. Yhwach takes Yugram's emotions and treats it like economics, something to put on a scale of balance in order to win his allegiance. The balance, the scale upon which Jugram judges the fortunes and misfortunes that surround him. Yugram's relationship with the scales is through a detached lens. He completely separates himself from the scale. His body and autonomy are the furthest thing removed from the scale in his own eyes. This holds weight since Yugram's body is prominent in characterizing him. His good looks are not only important in the obvious Aryan race analogy, but his body is unable to collect reishi like other Quincy's. He cognitively separates his flesh and blood from his ability, alongside how the mechanics behind his power are amplified through his shield. His sense of self-worth is so incredibly shallow, the balance scale becomes an emotional defense mechanism, a literal shield to hide behind. His purpose in life is derived purely from a higher power. Besides that, what does he hold in his life? We can draw a dynamic between Jugram and Askin with this. One's body is completely detached, the other's physical self is integral to his ability. They both maintain a balance and equilibrium within their abilities. Both of their senses of selves are incredibly shallow in differing manners. Their dynamic can be surmised in the scene where Yhwach has finished absorbing the Soul King. Not only does it speak to Yugram's devout loyalty, but he has no reaction to the physicality of Yhwach's appearance. Yhwach's appearance is the only thing Askin has his mind on. All that matters to Jugram is maintaining balance, which ironically enough is something Yhwach seeks to destroy. There would be no balance in Yhwach's world, merely oneness. The idea of balance requires differing forces in harmony rather than just melding the two together. His endgame is the destruction of distinction between life and death, worlds and people. His closest subordinate embodying that which he seeks to destroy is an interesting thing to have. However, as you've probably noticed, Jugram isn't the only case of this. Yhwach's assortment of his closest companions is another showcase of his contradictory nature. He actively surrounds himself with things he'll end up dismantling: the heart, evolution, balance. On the surface, a decision that doesn't make much sense, but tying it back to the Driscoll section, it's not just victory that Yhwach desires. It's complete domination. He has the aspects he desires to collapse guard him, and ultimately absorbs and dominates them. Each member of the Schutzstaffel demonstrates that Yhwach understands the value of these principles. If balance, evolution, and the heart were meaningless, he wouldn't elevate them above the majority of other Sternritter. Yhwach cannot tolerate anything existing independently of himself. It serves as another layer into why Jugram is his other half. Maintaining the balance of the universe is what has caused his people the most harm. Probably the most impactful thing he wishes to dismantle. It makes sense why he doesn't allow Jugram any independence beyond being the right-hand man. Taking a look at the Core 3 trailer poem, in which both of them speak at the same time, recognizing the world as a balance scale. Despite how opposing the two may seem, they begin at the same point. The world is imbalanced. Where they separate is in accepting and rejecting the scale itself. But additionally, it's even more evident of Yhwach's relationship with despair and hope. It's weaponized, much like Gerard in Hoffnung. Quincy's taking these intangible concepts and reifying them, specifically saying to weigh yourself in hope, as if hope is a tangible object you can feel in your hands. There is a reason why it's Jugram and Gerard as the very last Sternritter above everyone else, the penultimate symbols of what Yhwach desires to take. Jugram's entire life has been in service of another. Everything that defines him is something that passes through him, the Almighty being an example of this. Being able to share the power of Yhwach, it gives him importance within the hierarchy, but it's not his own strength. A man whose life never truly belongs to himself. It makes the decision that Jugram makes whilst having the Almighty that much more poetic, becoming the catalyst for these singular, unique moments for Jugram. For the first time, he acts not because he's following Bazz or because Yhwach ordered him, but because he made a choice. Jugram is banking on the fact that Yhwach will underestimate the vision he makes him see. It's a passive feature of the Almighty. Once you see it, it's no longer a threatening possibility. Jugram conveys the vision so vaguely that Yhwach can't tell if it was a dream or a vision. Yhwach immediately tries to classify it, and that's what Jugram is counting on. A flaw of the Almighty is that it doesn't remove interpretation, merely grants overwhelming confidence in interpretation. Everything becomes a certainty and manageable, but dreams are inherently uncertain. They're abstract concepts that nobody really understands. Each person has to try and interpret them for themselves. Jugram attacked Yhwach's humanity whilst he was blindsided by divinity, and Yhwach is successfully deceived because he classified it. He does what he always does, viewing a concept made to be abstract and restricting it to a particular format. Where Lille showcases the difference between seeing and understanding, Jugram exploits that difference. But I'd also like to explore a little more as to why Jugram specifically can exploit this difference. When inheriting the Almighty, he claims it to be cruel. Jugram completely reframes an ability that has been presented to be so overwhelmingly divine. Everyone is so busy being blinded by how unstoppable Yhwach is, but Jugram is one of the very few characters who actually gives any semblance of sympathy towards Yhwach. It highlights just how intimate their dynamic is. Just like at their ascension to the royal palace, he appeals to Yhwach's humanity. For a temporary time, he can see the world through Yhwach's lens, but he also has the knowledge to look at Yhwach and the world through his own perspective. He's aware and understands Yhwach's tyrannical side, but he's also simultaneously aware of how much of a victim Yhwach is. Emotionally, Jugram attempts to balance. Yhwach reduces emotions to certainty. With all this in mind, Jugram functions as Yhwach's emotional conscience. He feels the humanity that Yhwach has buried beneath his divinity. The tragedy is that Yhwach has no use for that half of himself. He continually rejects the compassion Jugram offers. Even though it's precisely the quality that could have broken the cycle, he seeks to escape, transforming the dynamic between a king and his subordinate into the relationship between a man and the part of himself he has chosen to abandon. Kubo has used a lot of religious symbolism and inspiration in Bleach. The most integral religion to Bleach's symbolism and narrative would probably be Buddhism, whilst the Quincy and Yhwach specifically also take inspiration from other religions that I'll be covering. His Buddhist symbolism helps paint how he inverts practically everything, twisting every ideal into a reflection of his own ego. Each religious parallel is equally recognizable and inverted within Yhwach. Within Buddhism, there exists the cycle of samsara, the unending cycle of death and rebirth, driven by karma and attachment. Those who practice Buddhism want to break free from samsara and achieve nirvana, the spiritual release from greed, ignorance, hatred, attachment, etc. Once the mind achieves a permanent, unconditioned state, they are subsequently removed from the cycle of life and death. Bleach's own universe has a very similar cycle. One of Yhwach's clearest correlations with the religion would be through nirvana. Yhwach's goal shares major similarities with it, but ultimately ends up being a warped version of it. He promises an end to conflict and death as a whole, but by eliminating the very aspect of distinction. Rather than freeing people from attachment, he absorbs them into himself. It's akin to enlightenment through annihilation. Yes, suffering does appear to end, but only because there are no longer separate wills capable of anything. The usual journey that people experience with aspects like Buddhism's nirvana or Christianity's heaven is they're first brought into the world on earth and attempt to reach those higher planes. For Yhwach, it's the inverse. He began in the heavenly domain and was removed from it. Where achieving nirvana requires freedom from attachment, Yhwach has a deep attachment to nirvana. To highlight this further, I'd like to add Yhwach's poem into this. Take one step in and never return. The Sea of Blood of the Universe. As the introductory volume to the 1,000-Year Blood War, it's an opening piece to give you a sense of scale of the arc. Once you step in, there's no going back. But taking another look at it, it ties in with Yhwach's version of Nirvana. The Sea of Blood of the Universe can refer to the lifeblood that created existence as we know it today, the primordial soup that was split apart and created the three worlds. Yhwach resided in this domain, taking one step in only to never return. It perfectly encapsulates Yhwach's whole essence for me. On the surface, it's imposing, threatening, and cosmically daunting, but looking at it again, it's quite pitiable. Alongside this, Buddhism teaches dependent origin, the idea that everything arises through causes and conditions, nothing exists independently. Yhwach's mechanics of existence invert this notion. As the progenitor of the Quincy race, he believes he is the singular origin point. Through the Auswählen, he recalls that life back to himself, reinforcing this idea that life should return back to a singular origin point. Individual lives possess no intrinsic value because they never truly belong to their owners. Their existence is merely borrowed from Yhwach until he decides to reclaim it. This creates a philosophical inversion, where Buddhism decentralizes existence, showing that no single being stands alone as an absolute cause. Yhwach re-centralizes existence around himself, denying the web of mutual dependence in favor of a single sovereign source. Yhwach embodies the very illusion Buddhism strives to abandon. Probably the most obvious parallel Yhwach has with religious symbolism is with Messianism, the belief that a singular figure will liberate a group from oppression, suffering, and evil. As always, Yhwach inverts this. The son of a divine being, possessing miraculous powers from birth, gathers disciples, grants blessings, and promises salvation to humanity. His followers devote themselves to him with unquestioning faith, believing death in his service is not defeat but fulfillment. Christ, however, saves humanity through self-sacrifice. His revival represents victory over death through love. Yhwach saves humanity through domination. His revival represents the demolition of mortal constructs as we know it. The Christian book of Revelation describes God as both the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Similarly, Yhwach is the origin of the Quincy race and the end for each of them. Their lives are not truly their own, turning an empire into a theological hierarchy. Following through with Revelation, the Thousand-Year Blood War mimics the book heavily. A final war, a collapse, an apocalyptic scale of destruction. But where Yhwach distinguishes himself with this parallel is that he both acts as Christ and the Beast, simultaneously the Savior and the Destroyer. The Auswählen is emblematic of this. Throughout scripture, divine judgment repeatedly separates humanity, sheep and goats, righteous and the wicked. Yhwach performs his own divine judgment, weeding out those deemed impure. His divine judgment is entirely utilitarian. Those on the retracting end lose everything. Those on the receiving end gain temporary power. The moral angle is completely removed, enacting this judgment from a high position where nobody can refute his decision. His position as the Almighty is another warped version of God in Abrahamic theology, where God is depicted as outside time, able to view past, present, and future at once. However, where God knows every future, Yhwach attempts to rewrite every future. Rather than existing outside causality, he's attempting to become causality. You can also equate this parallel to the Soul King. The number 3 has continually surrounded Yhwach, naturally inviting comparisons to Christianity's Holy Trinity. Kubo twists that symbolism in a way that mirrors Yhwach's broader philosophy. Within Bleach, Yhwach simultaneously occupies the role of both father and son. He is born through the prayers and fragments of the Quincy, yet he is also their progenitor, the source from which every Quincy life originates. His followers therefore become the ones who gave him life and the children who inherit it from him. Rather than existing as distinct persons united in perfect communion, as in the Christian Trinity, these relationships collapse back into a single figure. Even the Shrifts can be viewed through this lens. They are the fragments of Yhwach's soul bestowed upon his followers, remaining with them throughout their lives before ultimately returning to him through the Auswählen. In that sense, they resemble a warped Holy Spirit, not a divine presence guiding believers towards God, but God's own essence residing within believers, only so it can eventually be reclaimed. The name of God holds immense importance not only in Jewish tradition, but for specifically Yhwach himself. God's true name, the Tetragrammaton, a name supposed to be unspoken and untainted by man's tongue. It certainly helps since the name has no vowels. Technically speaking, the letter Y can be considered, but in this case the name is supposed to be metaphorically and literally unpronounceable. But not only that, the ability to name something inherently brings forth the idea of understanding it, possessing authority over it. A name that's unspeakable holds credence to whatever it is beyond us. Kubo's rendition makes the most prominent part of Yhwach's pronunciation the letter A. It's a name that, upon first recognition, is supposed to trip you up, challenge what you know, and attempt to conceptualize something divinely cryptic. Every single first reaction I've seen from the story has had the same reaction to his name. Something along the lines of, how do I pronounce that? A character so initially beyond you that his name is unspeakable. Obviously, having a character whose name you can't pronounce will be a pain production-wise, but the overall idea still stands. I'd also like to bring up a theory that's been pretty interesting to think about for me. If we take the example that Yhwach is the son of Adneus and apply it to other examples of the Soul King, Gerard being the heart, Pernida the left hand, Mimihagi the right hand, an interesting way to perceive Yhwach is that he's the soul of the Soul King. It's Yhwach's soul that is split apart when touched. The only reason he's able to grow is because of his soul. The reason he believes that his father has forsaken the Quincy race is because Yhwach is his father's way of helping the Quincy race. The only reason Yhwach isn't aware of this fact is because of his complete inability to look within. It is merely a theory. The Soul King's will as to why he allowed himself to be dismembered is unknowable to us. There are many differing ways to view the dynamic between these two, but it's an interesting thought that I thought I'd share. But to close out the religious section, looking at what religions are less on an individual scale, almost every religion points towards something greater than oneself. Yhwach's mechanics are wholly opposed to the concept of religion. Buddhism points away from attachment, Christianity towards self-sacrifice, Judaism views God as transcendent. These religions teach us to transcend the ego. Yhwach universalizes the ego, replacing the very idea of transcendence with himself, which ultimately leaves a question Kubo never explicitly answers. Is Yhwach's divinity genuine, or merely absolute power mistaken for divinity? If a being can rewrite the future, erase death, reshape reality itself, and command the worship of millions, what separates that being from a god? Is divinity defined by power or by the way that power is exercised? Religions teach us to self-reflect, but his gaze is never turned inward, only outward. Every contradiction he carries is projected onto the universe itself until reality is forced to accommodate him. Rather than changing himself to fit the world, he seeks to change the world to fit himself. Despite all of his religious imagery, Yhwach ironically stands as Bleach's most irreligious character. And of course, when it comes to inverting symbolism, not only does the Quincy's figurehead partake in it, but his rival as well. Ichibe Hyosbe, labeled as the ringleader of Squad Zero, and rightfully so. Ichibe is a criminal of cosmic proportions. He represents institutional authority over reality itself. Every aspect of his character, from names to ink to Buddhism to the Soul King, revolves around preserving an existing order by defining what things are allowed to be. Yhwach's war is a rebellion against that authority, the man who seeks to supplant the author, a conqueror like no other. Ichibe is a very particular character. As arguably the most meta character within the entire medium, he's a fan favorite to a small subsect of readers. Occupying the space of the author within the narrative, his Zanpakuto Ichimonji has the ability to remove the name and rename anything in existence. The very ink on the pages we read is his power, names being integral to power. Once removed or painted over with the color black, that thing becomes devoid of any power or meaning. Chapter 565, God Like You, shows us the very foundations of Yhwach's birth and growth. The child is completely void. It has nothing. No name, agency, family, nothing. It's only when the child takes the name of the god his people worship for his own that the black is removed, and Ichibe's authority is overwritten. Whilst it isn't a confirmed thing within the story itself, Ichibe being the one responsible for putting Yhwach in this state adds a lot to why their feud is so personal. Looking at the anime original sequence, we can see as Yhwach regresses into that state, he is essentially robbed of everything and painted black. Yhwach, never having a name of his own, is symbolic of the place he wishes to return to. It has been removed and erased from existence as we know it. The aspect and exploration of names is highlighted between these two. There's both the aspect of their individual ways of controlling identity, Ichibe through being able to rename people. Yhwach, as I've extensively showcased, restricts the identity of the Vandenreich. Then, to themselves specifically, Ichibe does not like it when his name is called. exactly why Yhwach vehemently insists on naming him throughout the entire fight. Ichibe's position as the one who has authority over naming others, someone else challenging his authority by constantly naming him, is an insult, pushing him into the corner he holds others in. For Yhwach, his name is a great sense of pride for him. The only reason he can stand before Ichibe is because of the name he took. At the very base of existence, where he had absolutely nothing, the respective relationship these two individuals have with their names highlights their status in the world, the very pinnacle against the very bottom. The entire fight is somewhat comically theatrical. Yhwach positions himself above the author, constantly repeating his name. Ichibe responds by removing his voice. Yhwach grants himself a voice. Ichibe cuts his power in half. Yhwach gives it back. Yhwach uses a secret technique. Ichibe uses a secret technique. Neither of them are rattled by the other, as if they both understand the script they're acting out, all the way until Ichibe unleashes Ichimonji, and we get chapter 609A. As Ichibe unleashes Ichimonji, Yhwach is painted over and for some minutes returns back to the state which he fears most. The ink covers his expression, all but his eyes. He doesn't speak, he doesn't move, completely still and void of any agency. At this moment, he has returned to nothing. Yhwach has lost. But in order for Yhwach to win this fight, he had to lose. During the anime original sequence, Ichibe states, "Those eyes will never open again until the day you die." From my perspective, this was Yhwach's death, and that's exactly why his eyes opened. Without even trying, he fulfilled the Kaiser Gesang. 900 years for his pulse, 90 years for his mind, 9 years for his strength, and 9 days for the world. The reason that Yhwach comes out on top in this fight lies behind Ichibe's philosophy and position in the story. He edits and categorizes that which already exists. He governs the position of the most authorial power within the story. How do you go about beating the author of the story? If someone already occupies the top of the hierarchy, you transcend the medium, placing yourself outside the confines of the laws of existence. Yhwach's origin point came from nothing. His very first action upon existence is self-definition. That's why Ichibe ultimately cannot categorize him. He believes that names determine reality. Yhwach believes that reality determines names. This part is less about technical analysis and more me gushing about how awesome this character is, because he might be the most conceptually fascinating character I've come across. Now, I'd like to dissect perhaps the most confusing scene Kubo has conceived. Once Yhwach topples Ichibe and moves on towards the Soul King, Ichibe is brought back by Ichigo and asks him to stop Yhwach, then proceeding to apologize, saying they can't stop Yhwach, but that's what all peace is like. Isn't that right, Yhwach? At first glance, what the hell is he talking about? But these couple of pages really do a lot. It doesn't feel like dialogue exchanged between two characters. Ichibe's eyes are fixed just as much on the reader as they are on Yhwach. The speech bubble covers his mouth entirely. Rather than existing within the scene, his words seem to spill out of the manga itself. It's as if he's momentarily stepped beyond the page to speak to both his audience and his creation. Ichibe isn't describing Yhwach's ideal world, he's describing his own. The peace maintained by the Soul King, the Gote 13 and the Royal Guards was never built upon harmony. It was established through violence, sacrifice, and the continual suppression of conflict. Every stable world in Bleach exists because someone was willing to stain their hands to preserve it. Peace is never innocent. It is simply a conflict whose victor survived long enough to rename it. It's perhaps why Ichibe's ability is exactly that. Of everyone standing before him, Yhwach understands this philosophy better than anyone. His entire journey has been driven by the belief that his own peace can only be achieved through unimaginable bloodshed. To escape the terror of returning to that helpless infant, he wages war upon existence itself. He despises conflicts, repeatedly claiming to dislike unnecessary fighting, yet every step towards the peace he seeks demands even greater sacrifice. The man who hates conflict the most continually becomes its greatest architect. I like to think that at this moment, Ichibe takes a position alongside us and really picks apart Yhwach's contradictions. The world he wishes to create requires the very thing he claims to hate. Then what right do you have to demand a peace that can only exist because others suffered for it? However, his criticism of Yhwach is also a confession. Ichibe understands that peace requires sacrifice because he himself has spent centuries preserving those sacrifices. He is willing to sacrifice Ichigo if it means preserving the balance of existence. For Ichibe, Individuals have always been expendable, so long as the story itself continues, quite literally the author. But now, for something a bit more simple, throughout Bleach it's been showcased multiple times that the Zanpakutos people wield are a part of the person wielding it. They're not separate entities, rather the blade is them. And I know that technically speaking Yhwach's sword is not a Zanpakuto, but this analogy for Yhwach's lack of self is so perfect I had to share it. During chapter 608, Ichibe paints over Yhwach's sword. That without a name has no power. Given how integral swords are to identities, we the audience never learn what Yhwach's sword is called, and it's absolutely perfect. He has no self, no identity. Ichibe exposes that Yhwach never had an identity beyond his inherited role. The irony, however, being that Yhwach doesn't defeat Ichibe by the sword. In fact, he doesn't defeat anybody by the sword. He disrespects Yamamoto by dropping his real sword and using a handheld arrow to kill him. During his fight with Ichigo, he uses reishi blades. Yet again, he works against the framework of the story, where everybody has such a profound and meaningful relationship with their blades. Yhwach barely even uses it. He makes the name something that nobody can erase, once again transcending beyond what is known as the known. There is no room for comprehension or countermeasures against my power. He simply is, and you have to accept it. What this fight does for Yhwach is that it's essentially his blade is me moment. It's the culmination of a life spent climbing from absolute nothingness to absolute supremacy, standing before the very man who governs names themselves. Yhwach rejects the notion that identity can ever be bestowed upon him. His declaration isn't merely that he possesses a name, but that it belongs to him alone. No authority, no god, no author can strip it away. But yet again, it's another inversion, since it's not actually his name. The name doesn't come from his own desires or individuality. He states his name is Yhwach because he has to be. It's a performative identity, an identity that's so intrinsic to his mission he can't afford to relinquish it. His victory over Ichibe proves that no one else can define him, yet it also reveals that he has already allowed his purpose to define him entirely. As I mentioned, it's his blade is me moments, warping the natural sequences Bleach has been presenting to us, not only working into his dynamic with Ichibe but Ichigo too. Ichigo's self-acceptance makes him more human. Yhwach's puts him further and further away from humanity. The oppression and treatment of the Quincy race as a whole is a very difficult thing to not get behind. A race that has been tortured throughout existence finally gets its chance to fight back. But what really makes their suffering bleak for me is because of Ichibe. He has no sympathy, qualms, or cares for the race. When the fight ensues, the bubbly visage is dropped and he becomes sadistic. Yhwach even calls him out on this. He can be viewed through the lens of a warped and twisted bodhisattva. A bodhisattva postpones their own final enlightenment in order to guide all sentient beings towards liberation. Ichibe has postponed change not for others' liberation, but to eternally preserve the current order. He's a guide that never lets anyone leave. A bodhisattva guides people out of an empathy, a love for humanity. Ichibe inverts this, delaying transcendence because the system must continue. He fools Yhwach in this way. Each having their own personal identities more so revolve around a purpose, taking the Buddhist teachings of how attachment to identities and the material will ultimately lead to suffering. Ichibe's entire character revolves around this attachment. Beyond the identity as the author, he's a nobody. Multiple tie-ins between Ichibe and Yhwach, the same way Yhwach almost conceptualizes intangible things into something he can hold in his hand. Ichibe's ability treats names and identity in the same manner. Alongside how beyond their purpose, their senses of selves are practically void. I'd like to correlate this with Ichibe's and by extension the Soul King's powers. It's revealed during Core 4 that the Soul King's spiritual pressure is the color black, the highest representation of power within the Bleach universe. Ichibe taking that for himself is evident enough, I don't really need to go over that. But this physical representation of authorial power within the story is followed through with Yhwach. Upon absorbing the Soul King and the right hand, his design is drenched in black. This heavy, tar-like shadowy Reiatsu completely engulfs him, covering his real eyes as the Almighty is the only thing he can see. The presentation is just perfect. The panel borders can barely contain him as he absorbs the narrative more and more. Kubo himself can barely keep up as his ascension becomes a regression into a sketched pencil form. Again, mostly me just gushing. The presentation is some of the best the medium has to offer, and I absolutely adore it. But to start closing this section out, Buddhism views enlightenment as an awakening, realizing that reality is dynamic, loose, and never fixated. Ichibe's worldview is inherently rigid and fixated. His ability constricts identity to one singular thing. Rather than escaping the cycle of samsara, he's fixated on maintaining it. Where Ichibe essentially created samsara from nirvana in his defilement of the Soul King, Yhwach seeks to reform samsara into nirvana. Both Yhwach and Ichibe are deeply attached people despite how lofty and above it all they're depicted. Ichibe fears change. Everything he does fixes something into a determined, categorizable subject. Whilst Aizen had the ambition, Yhwach is the only person to successfully refute this categorization, where one fixates on the past, the history, the order, and permanence of the cycle, the other is stuck within the future. Fitting that the main character predominantly presides in the present. The fight and feud between these two is not simply the strongest Shinigami and the strongest Quincy. It pits the man who decides what reality is versus the man who will not abide by anything but his own definition of reality. And when it comes to someone defining their own reality, there's really only one man who can stand on Yhwach's playing field. All beings trust their superiors. They can't survive if they don't follow blindly. And those who are trusted seek to pass their burden to those above them. Those above them pass it higher still. And that is how all kings are created and how all gods are born. As the previous major antagonist, Yhwach's dynamic with Aizen is jam-packed to say the least. Ironic given that these two, at least in the original manga, have one on-screen interaction. In short, one represents humanity attempting to become God, the other, God attempting to erase humanity. These individuals who sought Heaven's throne, both being characterized through our main character externally by interacting with him, and internally through Oman Zangetsu and White. Both manipulate Ichigo through their own separate ways. Both keep two individuals closely at their side, where one seeks to betray them. You could ramble similarities all day, yet these parallels matter far less than why they are parallels. It's evident that Kubo made certain to showcase just how similar these two are, giving us the freedom to dissect how and why they differ. So much so that they eventually oppose one another. Much like Yhwach, during his time as the major antagonist, Aizen rejects the messaging that Bleach portrays of self-understanding and acceptance. For Aizen, it's through technology and science, relying on external power to bolster himself, eventually having the Hogyoku metaphorically replace his heart and showcasing just how shallow he is. Aizen's loneliness and his desire to obtain a heart with someone is buried by illusions of grandeur that finally come breaking apart during the Deicide arc. For both Yhwach and Aizen, their senses of selves and identities are incredibly shallow. For Aizen, it comes from the choices and decisions he's made, constantly rejecting himself and his heart. For Yhwach, he was literally born in the void. His first memory was nothingness, and his identity was consumed by his children. As I said in the intro, a figure I'd like to bring up to help showcase their dynamic is Nietzsche. From a Nietzschean perspective, the most integral tie-in between these two would be the famous statement that God is dead. The statement does not act as a celebration of atheism, rather it recognized that the traditional foundation of meaning had collapsed. Humanity now had to create its own values rather than inherit them from above. This statement has a lot of tie-in with Aizen. The Soul King sits above existence as an inert absolute. The worlds continue to revolve around a being incapable of acting for himself, and Aizen cannot tolerate this. He sees dependence upon an external authority as degrading. But this is where Aizen and Nietzsche somewhat begin to diverge, and where Aizen and Yhwach become somewhat similar. Because Deicide Aizen doesn't truly accept the consequence of God is dead. He looks upon the collapse of divine authority and concludes that meaning must now be created independently. But simultaneously, that belief in his own independence and meaning blinds him. It's he who should become the new authority. His pride completely engulfs him. This makes Deicide Aizen's ideology considerably close to Yhwach's. Both reject the Soul King's position as an unacceptable foundation for existence, but neither is content to simply live without God. They both attempt to resolve the problem of a dead or inadequate God by placing themselves above everyone else, doing so in some differing manners. Aizen seeks to exempt himself from everything else and stand above. Yhwach seeks to take everything into himself. Deicide Aizen sought to stand above the aspect of becoming. Yhwach desires the end of becoming. This is also why his development by the 1,000-year Blood War is so important. The Aizen we encounter in the final arc is no longer pursuing the same form of transcendence. He has already abandoned the ambition to place himself at the summit of existence. He still possesses his arrogance, his disdain for authority, and his refusal to submit, but his relationship with transcendence has changed. By the time of their confrontation, Aizen says, "If God is dead, I will define myself." Yhwach says, "If God is dead, I will define everyone." Deicide Aizen wants to escape the authority of God by becoming the authority himself. 1,000-year Blood War Aizen has already rejected the need to occupy that position. What remains is simply his refusal to kneel before someone who claims that position over him. 1,000-year Blood War Aizen comes very close to the ideal representation of the Übermensch. The Übermensch creates values rather than inheriting them, heavily revolving around self-overcoming and value creation. Aizen consistently rejects every established institution: the Soul Society, Central 46, the Soul King, traditional morality, determining his own path regardless of the consequences. Where his flaw used to lie was in immediately supplanting those institutions with himself, his identity being defined by what he opposed. Both of them, during their time as the main antagonist, failed to live up to the idea of the Übermensch. Everything Yhwach does originates from restoring something that once was. There is no creativity, no growth, merely returning to a primordial state. The ideals of the Vandenreich exist behind history. The Übermensch looks forward, which is another great irony of Yhwach. For all of his prowess with foresight, his goal revolves around looking backwards. Aizen cannot see the future, but continually acts towards becoming something that has never existed before. Where pre-time skip Aizen did a majority of things for his own benefit, during his confrontation with Yhwach he refutes that. He subtly relinquished his pride. However, he still keeps the same mentality of creating his own values. Crushing those who seek to control me has always been the only reason I take action. The difference between pre- and post-time skip Aizen lies in the fact that he realizes that you don't have to rule to be free. The contradiction of pre-time skip Aizen is that if you have to stand above everyone else to guarantee your independence, then you're still allowing other people's position to determine your own. Post-time skip Aizen has realized this. His greatest act of growth isn't becoming stronger or more transcendent, but relinquishing the need for transcendence to validate his freedom. And this is precisely what makes 1,000-year Blood War Aizen so incomprehensible to Yhwach. Yhwach's worldview is fundamentally instrumental. Every action must serve an end. Every conflict has an objective. If Aizen is fighting him, it must be because Aizen has aligned himself with the Soul Society, but Aizen rejects it. These 2 pages are some of the most efficient dialogue Kubo's put to page. Yhwach begins trying to define Aizen, fixing something to a particular format like he always does. "Stop projecting your anguish. You lost to Ichigo, so you want to fight me for the Soul Society." Aizen rejects those labels. If Yhwach's defining trait is the ability to impose his will upon the world, Aizen's defining trait is his refusal to let anyone else determine who he is or why he acts. It's what makes arguably his most famous line that impactful: "Welcome to my Soul Society." He's rejecting Yhwach's claim to define reality. It's less "this belongs to me" and more "you don't get to tell me what this world is or what my place within it will be." It's a subtle exchange but crystallizes why these 2 antagonists are perfect foils. Yhwach believes meaning comes from an all-encompassing authority, while the other insists that meaning must originate from the self, and Aizen understands this ideology better than anyone. Not too long ago, he was in those very same shoes, imposing his own conception of reality, believing he understands everyone and everything, his superior understanding giving him the right to quantify others. Standing against an exaggerated version of his former self, Aizen's dynamic becomes something really special. For all of us, Yhwach is absorbed and overshadowed with the future, but for Aizen, Yhwach is an enlightening mirror to his past, which, when taken literally, is why these 2 pages are so efficient. It's Aizen showing us how he's changed by essentially talking to his past self. It's an external representation of how, for one of the very few times in his life, he's self-reflecting. Kubo essentially externalizes Aizen's former ideology through Yhwach, allowing him to confront the philosophy he once embodied. It's why Yhwach specifically is the one to ask Aizen all these questions. He's interrogating the man he used to be, and if this were deicide Aizen, his insecurities would spill out and he'd be refuting every question Yhwach threw his way, but he doesn't, because he doesn't feel the need to, refusing to subscribe to Yhwach's restrictions. Whilst their end goals weren't exactly the same, the almost one-to-one philosophies they shared shows how their paths differed. From rejecting the Soul King, Aizen eventually grew beyond it. Yhwach doubled down on it. Aizen, representing self-overcoming and value creation, recognizes that struggle is part of what gives existence meaning. Yhwach sees suffering as something existence should be liberated from. The Nietzschean element lies in the act of overcoming something. Yhwach's demolition of difference would make it so there's nothing to overcome. Another showcase of difference between the two lies in Nietzsche's will to power. Nietzsche believes that in every human being, a fundamental desire to exert their power and control over the world around them and each other existed. The drive to continually overcome oneself. The Hogyoku almost functions as an external representation of will to power, as it rewards continuous becoming. Its function is to grant the wishes and desires of those around it, essentially bending and forming reality to the user's will. The Almighty grants the user the option to choose the outcome that most benefits them, a complete domination of reality to a singular person's desire. The differences being that the Hogyoku is not instantaneous, it's still a process of struggle and growth. The Almighty has no struggle. Everything becomes a breeze as the concept of struggle collapses. Yhwach seeks power, but the will to power requires resistance. The Hogyoku functions primarily as an embodiment of possibility, allowing something that does not yet exist to become possible. The Almighty represents inevitability, taking what could happen and forcing it to exist. The two characters appear vastly similar, both are incredibly intrinsic with control. Aizen's philosophy is generative, however, manipulating others because they can be manipulated, creating circumstances because they can change, experimenting to create something new, constantly producing possibility. Yhwach consumes possibility. Beyond religious imagery, Nietzsche provides one of the clearest philosophical lenses for Yhwach. Everything Yhwach does expresses the expansion of power. He does not merely seek victory, but a condition in which opposition becomes impossible, via a complete domination. At first glance, Yhwach appears to be Nietzsche's ideal sovereign, but the will to power is a fundamentally creative concept. Strength is demonstrated not by eliminating struggle, but by continually overcoming it. Nietzsche highlights another great irony of Yhwach. The man who seeks absolute power will create a world where power is meaningless. As I mentioned in the intro of this segment, both of them are characterized internally and externally through Ichigo. The two beings inside Ichigo can perfectly characterize Aizen and Yhwach in singular words. White is created, Old Man Zangetsu is inherited. White is the artificial hollow created by Aizen and found its way into Ichigo's self. By mere chance, an event involving his mother Masaki that wasn't planned out by Aizen whatsoever. Whilst Old Man Zangetsu, an entirely natural inheritance from his parentage, the Quincy blood within Ichigo that has manifested itself into a form of Yhwach, thanks to Ichigo's Shinigami powers. White merges with Ichigo's Shinigami powers thanks to Ishin's connection with keeping the Hollow at bay for 20 years. It eventually melded with it and became the true Zangetsu that we know now. Whilst the Old Man, once again, takes the name of Zangetsu and makes it his own. This serves as the building blocks for how these two antagonists function. Aizen is a scientist, manipulative, meticulous, controlling the narrative from behind the scenes, but he's just that. He's stuck within the boundaries of human interference, something he sought to transcend and move beyond. Yhwach's manipulation is a passive ability he possesses, something Aizen has to spend years crafting. Yhwach is just capable of without even trying. Everything that Ichigo does is for his benefit. The death of Masaki was not a calculated maneuver by Yhwach. It just simply happened at the correct time to set Ichigo down the path he walks now. The engineering and ambition of humanity that desires to reach the level of the gods, and the god who watches over all seeking to regress back to a primal form. Be it within or outside Ichigo, they manipulate him and help him grow. White has become more than the lapdog headhunting machine that carries out Aizen's will. White persistently desires to be recognized by Ichigo, desiring to have his name called and for him to be acknowledged as Zangetsu, an overall analogy for Aizen's subconscious desiring to form a heart. Old Man Zangetsu gives us a very melancholic dynamic between himself and his progenitor. Seeing the world through Ichigo's eyes for all of his life, he has a deep wound within his heart. The rain that fell on that tragic day and having to live with the knowledge that he's on some level personally responsible for it. The man who wishes to protect Ichigo no matter the cost from any semblance of danger. He does not like conflict. He cannot stand the thought of conflict, but over time learns courage. The anime original sequences gives us two examples of the singular tier of the king, where one falls from what is lost, the other from what has been gained. The evolution of both of these individuals came at the cost of their humanity. Aizen's arc throughout the Arrancar saga is a man refusing to look within himself. Yhwach has a fundamental inability to look within. Blinded by divinity, he can only see on a cosmic scale. The mechanics of their manipulations showcase how they reject Bleach's messaging, constant efforts, and a passive ability. It's a continuous action Aizen has to undergo to project what he wants others to see. For Yhwach, it's something I'd like to talk about for the end of this video, so just keep in mind this point. Aizen rejected Bleach's messaging through constant effort, Yhwach does it passively. Both of the conclusions to these antagonists are fitting mirrors to one another. Aizen's fate is to carry out his 20,000-year-long sentence within Muken, the deepest layer of the Soul Society, and Yhwach is stuck within the cage of God atop the heavens. Aizen receives the punishment of man, and Yhwach the punishment of God. Aizen's entire journey is an ascension out of reach of the main cast, the symbolism most likened to him being the butterfly. Yhwach is a regression of constant absorption of entities. They each have a void within themselves. Aizen's illusions cover up that hole within him. Yhwach's consuming is an almost never-ending process. Another person that can really help showcase the difference between the two is Ichigo. After Aizen's defeat, Ichigo felt his heart, gained understanding of the child behind all the illusions. Aizen, during the 1,000-Year Blood War, subtly changes from his former egotistical self. The culmination of this change comes through Kyoka Suigetsu. The man who once sought to transcend Ichigo ultimately dupes Yhwach by becoming him. In deceiving Yhwach with Ichigo's image, Aizen embodies not merely his appearance, but the ideals Ichigo represents. The man he once viewed as an experiment, someone to cultivate and surpass, is who he chooses to imitate. The understanding forged between them after deicide, the heart Ichigo recognized beneath Aizen's illusions, is finally turned against Yhwach. Ichigo is the one character capable of reaching the heart, even within the man who spent centuries convincing himself he didn't possess one. Aizen originally attempted to engineer transcendence. Yhwach attempted to inherit absolute transcendence. Ichigo represents multiplicity, showing that the world doesn't need to be reduced to one thing. Ichigo's journey is one of self-discovery and self-acceptance, the most meaningful moment for his character development, coming from understanding and accepting his inner self with the blade is me. Yhwach warps this with his self-actualizing moment revolving around a performative identity. I'm sure everyone watching this is familiar with Ichigo's introductory monologue.
My name is Ichigo Kurosaki. I'm 15 years old, so I'm a high school student. My family runs a medical clinic here in town. Maybe it's because we're entrusted with the lives of the living. I'm not sure. But for as long as I can remember, I've been able to see the souls of the dearly departed.
Being introduced to him personally through his own words, the name that was granted to him by his parents having multiple translations, such as Strawberry, the number 15, or the one who protects. Yhwach's introduction is conducted from a disconnected, outside perspective. The name we liken to him is not his name, merely stolen by those that praised him. The thesis and the antithesis. But with this sharp contrast, the two are also quite similar. Both witness the death of their parents. Both have a devout fear of being powerless in the face of death. Both are protectors. Respond, Ichigo, to the voices of the powerless, for those who can barely breathe without you. a clear parallel between the two. Yhwach knows the feeling of responding to these voices better than anyone. Ichigo from the beginning of the story has been someone who stands up for others. He has always been one who cares for the weak and those he loves. They both understand what it's like to have people to protect. A part of Ichigo's journey is allowing himself to share the burden of that protection, not having to take everything on himself. Yhwach's protection, as I mentioned before, is messianism, forcing hopes, dreams, and salvation onto one being. And instead of sharing that burden, he consumes it, an all-devouring protection. As I've been highlighting throughout the video, the Stone Ritter and by extension Yhwach operate as warped mirrors to those they oppose. Yhwach and Ichigo might be the best example of this. For Ichigo, the topics of parents are the crux of who he is, the death of his mother, and the self-inflicted guilt he held for it, to eventually overcoming that grief. Masaki is so integral not only to Ichigo but the story as a whole, a metaphysical heart that still beats even after death. Even with her imperfections, she is still like the sun, the courage to protect those you love. Through this, she and Yhwach might be the most opposite characters within the story, the sun and the rain. Yhwach's character is not only indirectly built up within the Thousand-Year Blood War, but throughout the entire story, thanks to the assistance of Old Man Zangetsu. I'm sure everyone is again familiar with Old Man Zangetsu's monologue about the rain, a tragic reflection of how Ichigo feels regarding his mother. The guilt of having enacted the rain, Old Man Zangetsu blames himself for having caused Ichigo so much pain, the same way Ichigo blames himself for causing his family so much pain. Both of them are not really at fault. The motif of rain is everywhere within Bleach, a constant reminder of Ichigo's lowest moment. Yhwach's very symbolism is Ichigo's darkest moment. Water and liquid is associated with him quite a lot. The primordial waters in which he resided, his blood connecting him and his children. The Ausfallen creates a downpour of rain. The singular tear of the king. The Vandenreich itself is covered in ice. And I'd like to tie this imagery back to Ichigo through one of the fandom's most beloved chapters, the sand, in which Ichigo reflects on the wheel of fate, where he wishes for a strong blade and enough strength to shatter fate. During Ichigo's fight with Yhwach, he speaks to Ichigo about the Almighty. The countless futures are like grains of sand scattered before him. But Kubo does something special with both the analogy of sand and rain with the after-chapter drawings. The fight begins with what appears to be the grains of sand falling down. As Ichigo fights back against the despair Yhwach pressures him with, it appears as if he's cut through all the grains of sand falling down on him, only for Yhwach to reclaim his narrative, and we see it wasn't every grain, but merely a singular one. Taking the narrative, taking the story, and using it against our main character through the lens he despises most, as an onset of sand starts raining down on him. Ichigo is the prime example of Yhwach's warped parentage, and how that translates to this horrifying relationship with hope and despair. He parents Ichigo not to sink into despair. He's a direct foil to the Ulquiorra fight, where the fourth Espada vehemently attempts to have Ichigo sink into despair. Ichigo never wavers. Yhwach constantly tells Ichigo to never give up hope, only for him to break. Please, Ichigo, do not give up hope. There is nothing more painful for a parent than killing a child in despair. And yet, once Ichigo lies broken in front of him, he does possibly the most surreal thing this character could have done. He laughs at him, not a slight chuckle, but like a madman, as if a lifelong vision has been vindicated. Throughout the entire fight, he doesn't immediately body Ichigo. He lets him struggle, he lets him hope, like he's waiting for the inevitable. And to really cement just how impactful this fight is, I need to go over a couple things. A somewhat common take for Bleach is that the story could have ended at the Arrancar saga, right after Aizen's defeat and when Ichigo has lost all his powers. When it comes to the crux of Ichigo's development in self-actualization, the story ending here doesn't make much sense. During Ichigo's journey throughout the first half of Bleach, he wears the hollow mask signifying the disconnect between Ichigo and his inner self, something he vehemently tries to reject over and over again. Hollows themselves are purely unconscious, instinctual beings, until they gain a mask that allows them to suppress instincts. Ichigo's journey with White is a reverse of what a hollow has with itself. Instead of gaining the mask, Ichigo needs to remove it. Symbolized during the Horn of Salvation, the mask is not present, rather the hollow has become a part of him, wholly integrated into himself. foreshadowed as he was preparing to learn the final Getsuga Tensho. Secondly, a major integral part of who Ichigo is comes from his hair, the hair he inherited from his mother. He's picked on for it, and it's part of what connects him and Orihime. During the Deicide arc, his Mugetsu form sees him donning long black hair, red eyes, and this black Reiatsu. It's not very emblematic of who Ichigo is. During this point in the story, Ichigo has accepted his powers, but he doesn't understand him. That's exactly why the story doesn't stop there. Ichigo's growth isn't done, because as cool as the form is, this isn't really his true self, which is exactly again why during the final fight, his hair retains its original color. Why, at least in my eyes, Ichigo dons this appearance is precisely because at this point in the story, he's accepted his powers, but he doesn't understand them, merely integrating them at a face value level. The same way that Yhwach, when looking upon Ichigo, doesn't see the man he's become, but the power he's supposed to have. It simultaneously works as a form of progression for Ichigo, foreshadowing the Thousand-Year Blood War, and characterization for the man it resembles. But lastly, Ichigo brings along the most impactful person in his life. What Orihime represents thematically is enormous for both of their characters. Throughout the story, Rain is depicted as Ichigo's darkest moment, the separation between two hearts. Orihime's poem is the singular depiction of Rain in a positive light. The two of them have gone through a lot in their lives, and ultimately desire the strength to protect one another. For much of the story, Ichigo shoulders the responsibility himself, and here he finally allows the burden to be shared. The heartwarming moment where Orihime used to be terrified of Ichigo's Vasto Lorde form to now be able to see him with the horn and the heartwarming smile she knows and loves. All of this leads me back to the fight. Ichigo's true self, finally amassed against the most powerful enemy the universe could conjure. And the entire fight is a systematic breakdown of who Ichigo is. Ichigo overcomes despair time and time again, finally using his Bankai that everyone has been waiting for. Yhwach breaks it. 2 times Ichigo's blade has been broken. 2 times has he been utterly powerless. Ichigo, after so much strain and inner turmoil, finally gains the Horn of Salvation. Yhwach breaks it off and weaponizes it against him. He brings along the most impactful person in his life. Yhwach separates the two not only physically, but her ability to protect has been made obsolete. And then he finally robs him of his power, leaving him completely and utterly hopeless. This might be the clearest projection Yhwach has ever enacted. He quite literally renders Ichigo useless. Nothing works against him. The blade is broken. Orihime's shield is futile. He has no agency, no options, nothing. Almost like a helpless child in the face of death. That is vindication for Yhwach. He laughs because Ichigo despairing is merely the script going completely according to how he envisioned it. The truth that hope is a mere illusion is right in front of him. Yhwach's psyche by the time of this fight is so interpretable. Many differing ways you can view it, like the inner conflict between the author Yhwach and the character Yhwach being projected onto Ichigo. The author can't have his main character falter, but the person requires Ichigo's eventual defeat. Skipping slightly forward, he tells Ichigo his resistance was soothing. Ichigo's struggle being ultimately futile confirms Yhwach's worldview. It's a twisted sense of a parental dynamic, and one of the greatest displays of an antagonistic force I've had the pleasure of witnessing. Alongside this, the entire fight is a callback to other major moments for Ichigo. Byakuya breaks his blade, Yhwach breaks his blade. Ginjo steals his power, Yhwach steals his power. Aizen leaves a portal to follow him, Yhwach does the same. Yhwach not only systematically broke Ichigo down to his barest form, but major parts and structures of the fight have been taken from the narrative itself. He's so incapable of creativity that his demolition of Ichigo is robbed from every other fight. But it's poetically the antagonist who had put Ichigo in the lowest moment we had seen up until that point, who come and get Ichigo back upon his feet. Much like Ichigo's relationship with Aizen, Ichigo felt the heart of those he fought, and they grew from it. That heart coming back to revitalize him once more. During the end of the Deicide arc, we get to hear Ichigo's thoughts on Aizen, and I think both of the downfalls of each major antagonist complement each other perfectly through Ichigo. Ichigo doesn't speak on Yhwach at all, and I love it. Not during Yhwach's monologue, nor in the epilogue, and it's partly, in my opinion, the prime example of Kubo's method of storytelling. The visuals are just as important as the dialogue. Ichigo's entire journey has already answered Yhwach. Aizen understands what Yhwach became because not too long ago he was in a very similar mindset. Ichigo is the embodiment of the philosophy that Aizen speaks of. Aizen's words are paramount in his characterization. The guy who would always be the domineering force in conversation. Not to say Ichigo's character doesn't come from words, but I mean, take for example the fight against Yhwach. He doesn't tell Orihime what he's planning beforehand. He trusts her completely and she recognizes his actions and lets them speak for him. Yhwach spent the entire story building Ichigo to become a weapon. He loses philosophically because Ichigo's existence demonstrates that despair isn't the inevitable conclusion to life. Someone can experience loss, grief, fear, and death without surrendering their heart. That has been Ichigo's answer since the death of Masaki, and it's the answer Yhwach can never account for with the Almighty. It's a very common trope for stories to have the main character have the final word against the antagonist. Kubo, however, instead leaves only silence. Ichigo doesn't need to argue against Yhwach because his entire life has already done so, and Yhwach completely missed it. Looking through his entire life as something for his benefit, a weapon to eventually be wielded by his own hand, overlooking why the blade is him. As I've talked about throughout the entire video, Yhwach is antithetical to the very heart and soul of Bleach. When you have a character who is the antithesis of Yhwach, he simply wraps back around to being the thesis. Uryu and Ichigo are integrally connected to one another, especially by the time the 1,000-year Blood War comes around. Both seek to avenge the mothers they lost against the man who robbed her from them. Both seek to protect those they still care about in the here and now. The major difference being that Ichigo eventually chooses who he wants to become. Uryu spends most of the story trying to become the person he thinks he should be, which is what makes his development against Jugram that more special. Uryu being our introduction to the Quincy race, he's our basis of knowledge for them. For a majority of the story, the history of the Quincy's is shrouded in mystery. Once the 1,000-year Blood War comes around, Yhwach robs Uryu of his role as the fountain of our understanding, and takes it for himself. Uryu's antithesis both works as the fundamental opposite of how the Shinigami function, and it works to pit him against the Quincy King. His fundamental inability to be honest with himself is entirely because of the impact the culture of Quincy has had on his life. Every single time Uryu helps one of his friends, he always has an excuse prepared for why he's helping them. Every act of kindness has to be justified. Every friendship has to be disguised as obligation or rivalry. Uryu constantly reframes his own emotions because acknowledging them would mean rejecting the rigid identity he believes he has to uphold. His character shows how much trying to conform to a role or live up to a legacy can stunt your personal growth. I don't think that by this point in the video, I need to explain how trying to live up to a role can stunt Yhwach's personal growth. Uryu is antithetical to the cold hard regime of the Vondenreich, Jugram serving as the perfect foil in which both of these individuals have a deep inner conflict within themselves about the man they serve. The thing that crushes Jugram's cold emotionless veneer is the heart. It's the idiocy and general unseriousness of friendship that breaks through Jugram's defenses more than any attack Uryu could ever muster, recollecting that yes, his friendship might have been convoluted and messy, but the feelings of that friendship are undeniable. After so much of the series of having an Uryu who's constantly reframing his reasons for helping Ichigo, he's finally true to himself. Jugram functioning as the embodiment of the transactional mindset Yhwach has. Uryu refutes this. There is no right or wrong, it merely is. Yhwach's worldview ultimately cannot account for the intangible. It's why he tries so hard to quantify them, but he's completely missing the point. Untouchable by the scales of balance, Jugram's role in the fight represents that Yhwach's regime cannot repress genuine human emotion. This brings me to the still silver arrow. Whilst the overall execution was a bit rushed, as Kubo was injured at the time of writing the 1,000-Year Blood War, what the arrow does thematically and symbolically is still fantastic. The silver taken from the hearts of Quincy's who have been hit with the Auschweilen, when mixed with the blood of the person who enacted it, all of the person's abilities for a brief moment will cease to exist. Each of the fallen Quincy who didn't get a chance to refute or fight back against his will are now finally offered the opportunity to get back against the man who robbed them of everything. It is quite literally the thesis of the entire story put into a singular object, where Yhwach's mechanics say that they exist for him. They refute this. Even after death, we still possess agency. Even without a form, we will never stop walking. Mechanically speaking, it makes sense that the only way to beat Yhwach's insanely overpowered ability is to completely remove it. But again, thematically, it's supposed to point out something major. Who is Yhwach without his power? When both Ichigo and Uryu lost their powers, they were able to keep moving forward because of those around them, whilst there were bumps in the road for each of them. In the end, it was their connections and their courage that kept pushing them forward. When Yhwach loses his power, he has nothing. There is nobody to encourage him, nobody to assist him. The reason the Quincy fear him during his introductory scene is because at the flick of his finger, their life could end. Take that away, and what is he? During the backstory with Jugram and Bazz, the people do not bow out of reverence for his benevolence, but because they're forced to. Take that away, and what is he? Bleach almost entirely revolves around dependence. Ichigo accepting Orihime's assistance is one of my favorite moments in the story. Rukia and Renji, Kinpachi and Unohana, Mayuri and Nemu, Shunsui and Nanao, even Aizen is depending on the fact that Ichigo will be able to finish the job after Yhwach takes him out. Yhwach rejects this philosophy entirely, flipping the framework on its head, making everyone dependent on him. Its possession, stagnancy alongside dependency being a major theme. When someone loses everything, they grow from it, all except for Yhwach. Losing for Yhwach means regression. Yhwach alone cannot survive loss. The moment his power disappears, there is nothing left to sustain him, because unlike everyone else in Bleach, he never built his life upon people. He built it upon certainty, and certainty is something Bleach argues no one is ever entitled to. Each and every one of these mistakes Yhwach has made throughout his life come together for his defeat. Those struck down by the Ausfallen come back through the Silver Arrow and remove the Almighty. The illusion from a man seemingly so one-dimensional showcases his inability to look within. The opposition from a man who previously sought heaven's throne, using his illusions not only to deceive, but to showcase how he's grown from that pride and a blade to shatter fates. Each major player in Yhwach's defeat all have one tie-in symbolically: courage. By this point in the video, if you sat through the entire thing in one go, you're probably sick of me making this point. Yhwach does everything wrong. Yhwach is an inversion of theological or philosophical symbolism. He's antithetical to the messages Bleach teaches us about life, etc, etc. But after spending this entire video explaining where Yhwach went wrong, there's one final question I'd like to propose. Was he ever capable of getting it right? A child with nothing, what other choice for survival than to take from what was around him? Even upon having his eyes removed at the very end, he doesn't see the courage reflected in the eyes of Ichigo. He's stuck in attempting to remove fear. After all the knowledge and memories he's absorbed, one thing above all others dominates them. His soul exists to heal others, to return sight, movement, even hope, an ability to give joy to the people. Yet the one thing his own ability never grants him is that very same pleasure. It's a common depiction in practically everything that's existed, be it religion, philosophy, or bare human experience, that giving joy to others will in return give joy to you. So then, why does the fear of death dominate all others? I believe that him essentially being an inverse of everything applies to the very foundation and fundamentals of his existence. The mechanics of his existence turn emotion into a transaction, viewing every conceivable concept through the most reductive lens. These mechanics lead me to perceive that he was fundamentally built to be wrong, and that is something I cannot fault him for. And whilst yes, his choices do matter, responsibility doesn't make circumstance irrelevant. And like I've been hammering home this entire video, Quincy's and their inherent lack of agency is a major part of them. The king being the progenitor of this flaw, having no say in his own matter, who had no opportunity to refute the fact that he was built to be wrong, is perfectly poetic. Allman Zangetsu showed us a different path in which Yhwach's life could have turned out, but that was only made possible because he saw through the lens of Ichigo. The overarching irony of Yhwach is that for all of his sight, he lacked perspective. The tragedy is that he was never allowed to have another perspective. As I mentioned in the Aizen section, Aizen's rejection of Bleach's thesis came from constant effort. Yhwach's antithetical nature is a passive ability. Out of all the souls he's absorbed, all the memories he's experienced, they all filter themselves to the exact same thing. Ichigo has been shown time and time again that differing perspectives help shape him and make his own choices, furthering him as a person. Yhwach has experienced more than anybody in the entire story, probably more than the entire story put together, yet his viewpoint never expands. Him being drenched in black symbolizes that no matter how much he consumes, the only thing he outputs is nothingness, seeking to disband dismantle the very thing that makes life meaningful. He's a black hole for meaning. The greatest irony, contradiction, paradox, whatever you want to call it of Yhwach, is that his character revolves upon self-definition, yet he simultaneously has no say as to who he is. His identity is a collective, yet he's completely self-serving and self-centered. He is nothing, yet he is everything. He is the father and he is the son. He is the conqueror who despises conflict. He gives joy yet inherits fear. He is the all-seeing God and a completely blind man. He absorbs all the symbolism you could offer, yet none of it translates to his actual self. He surrounds himself with that which he seeks to destroy. He desires to rid the world of the fear of death, yet the child did not fear. The child could not see, hear, speak, or even move. But fear? None. Somehow, he knew that he would survive. But over centuries, Yhwach becomes the vessel through which humanity pours its own fear of death, loss, and suffering. Because there ultimately is no separation between Yhwach and those connected to him, their fear becomes his own. His heart is a warped reflection of the very heart Bleach celebrates. The metaphysical connection has been viscerally corrupted. When Ulquiorra speaks to Orihime about the heart, she says that whilst people may not be fully connected and understand one another, it's still possible to care about them and feel them in some sense. Aizen previously embodied the pinnacle of separation from the heart. Yhwach embodies the pinnacle of connection. There is no distinction between him and others. He knows everything upon absorption, constantly taking experience and life into himself. He does fear returning back to the state of helplessness. It's partly why the war is waged, but it's another irony of Yhwach. His goal is rooted in the removal of the fear of death, yet the child he once was had none. The very basis of Yhwach is certainty, which makes why he desires complete domination that much more understandable. Even without any means of survival, he knew he would survive. Having such unimaginable confidence and assurance in oneself, Yhwach begins life absolutely certain that death cannot claim him. His first experience of existence is absolute certainty. His first defeat, therefore, isn't just a military loss, it completely breaks the assumption upon which his identity was built. Hence why his ability, the Almighty, removes every aspect of uncertainty. As I said at the end of the Uryu section, certainty is something that Bleach argues nobody is guaranteed. Yhwach forces the narrative to say otherwise, and this absolute certainty is the most harrowing thing the story has to offer. Much like the ironic demise of most Stoneritter, the fear dies afraid, the heart dies heartlessly, the heat falls to the cold, rational balance, divinity is undone by its own power, the concept of evolution chokes on its own growth. Yhwach, in much the same way, becoming the embodiment of fatalism, is fate's greatest prisoner. The child knew he would survive, and the child was right, because Yhwach never dies. His defeat at the first invasion simply left him sealed. His final defeat leaves him sealed into the very world he cannot stand to exist in. The child doesn't fear helplessness, but the adult does. And, as the antithesis of Bleach, his story does not end with walking even without a form. His ending is that he doesn't have one. The child will survive, living without life, forever. And with that, we have finally arrived at the end of this video. Definitely the most ambitious project I've ever given myself. Even with that in mind, and as silly as it sounds, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface with this character. If I really put myself to the task and went through with everything about him, this video, however, would have been hours and hours long. And as I currently am, I don't have the skill to go for something like that just yet. As I said in the intro, I've been thinking about making this video for a while. Since before I even made my first video. There's so much to this character. He is a goldmine for interpretation, and just how absolutely masterfully constructed he is. And as you can probably tell by the final segment, I really wanted to get across something I haven't seen anybody talk about when it comes to his character, just how tragic he is. Does Yhwach deserve this fate? To some degree, yes. Is it still tragic? Absolutely. It might be the most moving part of his character for me. I can't help but pity him. And with that, hopefully, I've been able to help give you a new perspective on Yhwach, or beyond that, any of the Stoneritter I mentioned, looking at them in a new light. I did originally plan to include every one of them, but some of them just didn't really fit well enough structurally. There were many things that didn't eventually make the cut, and I might make some of these leftover points into threads on Twitter. I'll leave a link to my profile in the description below if any of you are interested. Firstly, I'd like to thank Kubo. Even with a busted shoulder, this guy was outputting some of the best shonen that's been put to pen, and without getting too personal, this character means a lot to me, so thank you. Secondly, I'd like to thank Spooky and Crit for helping with some of the segments, and then thank you, the viewer, for watching this video. It means a lot to me. I'll most likely be making more Bleach videos in the future, maybe another structurally similar video as this one but with Aizen and the Espada, maybe some Orihime, Kisuke or Masaki, but with the Hell arc most likely continuing somewhat soon, Bleach is sure to pop up on the channel again. Alongside this, I might be doing some commentaries or reactions on upcoming episodes of the 1000-Year Blood War. Not really sure just yet, but if I do, I'll post something on Twitter as a notice. But with all that out of the way, one last time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.